The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering down on the lonely highway as Dr. Darius Wells clutched the steering wheel, with a desperation that turned his knuckles pale against the dark leather. The night was a void, pitch black and suffocating, broken only by the frantic streaks of streetlights whipping past his windshield. Each drop of water striking the glass sounded like a war drum in his ears, a brutal rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Somewhere out there, in the labyrinth of the sleeping city, a little girl named Sophia Kane was clinging to life her fragile existence, tethered to the skill of his hands. He was her last chance, her only hope, and the weight of that truth gnawed at him like a living thing. The call from St. Mary's Hospital had come like a gunshot through the quiet of his eventing and urgent, clipped voice delivering the news that Sophia's congenital heart condition had taken a sudden, vicious turn. There was no time to waste, no room for error. Darius was the only surgeon within reach who could navigate the delicate maze of her failing heart, and every fleeting second was a thread unraveling from the thin fabric of her survival. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as he wove through the sparse late-night traffic, his mind a storm of rehearsed incisions and calculated risks. He'd saved lives before countless times, but this felt different. This wasn't just about precision or expertise. It was a desperate sprint against an unforgiving clock, and the stakes were unbearable. A glance at his watch told him he had 10 minutes. 10 fleeting minutes to bridge the distance between him and the operating table. Failure wasn't an option, it was a death knell. The traffic light ahead flickered yellow, a fleeting warning in the downpour. Darius's pulse surged, his breath catching as he made the split-second choice to defy it. The light bled to red as his car shot through the intersection, tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Angry horns blared behind him, a cacophony of outrage he barely registered. In his mind, there was only Sophia, a faceless child whose life he could already feel slipping through his fingers. He muttered a quiet apology to the chaos he left in his wake, his focus razor-sharp. Just as his chest began to loosen with the faintest hint of relief, a flash of blue and red pierced the darkness behind him. The shrill wail of a siren sliced through the rain-soaked silence, yanking him back to the present with brutal force. Not now, Darius hissed under his breath, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The police cruiser loomed closer, its lights painting the interior of his car in stark, accusing hues. His stomach twisted as he eased the vehicle to the shoulder, the rain intensifying as if to mock his plight. The world outside was a blur of water and shadow as a figure approached, broad and imposing, his silhouette distorted by the deluge. Darius rolled down the window, the cold night air rushing in to slap against his face, carrying with it the sharp scent of wet pavement. License and registration, the officer barked, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade. His tone was clipped, devoid of warmth, and his face illuminated briefly by the cruiser's lights bore the hard lines of a man who'd long since stopped listening to excuses. The name tag pinned to his soaked uniform read Victor Kane. "Officer, please," Darius began, his voice steady but laced with a raw edge of urgency. "I'm a surgeon. I'm on my way to an emergency. A child's life is hanging in the balance. I don't have time for this." His words tumbled out, each one heavy with the weight of the truth. But Victor's expression didn't soften. The officer's jaw tightened, his pale eyes narrowing as he studied Darius with a skepticism that bordered on disdain. "You ran a red light," Victor said, his voice flat and cold as the rain dripping from the brim of his cap. "That's reckless driving." "I know, and I'm sorry," Darius replied, his hands tightening on the wheel until his knuckles ached. "But there's no time to explain. If I don't get to the hospital, she'll die." His plea hung in the air, fragile and desperate. But Victor's lips curled into a faint, mocking smirk. "Everyone's got a story," he said, tilting his head as if sizing Darius up. "Step out of the car." Darius froze, his breath catching in his throat. "You're not hearing me," he said, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I don't have time for this." Every second that ticked by was a theft, a cruel robbery of Sophia's fading chances. But Victor's gaze remained unyielding, his hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered weapon. "Out, now," the officer ordered, his tone brooking no argument. Darius's chest tightened as he pushed the door open and stepped into the storm. The rain soaked through his thin jacket in an instant, chilling him to the bone. But the cold was nothing compared to the icy dread pooling in his gut. Behind Victor, another officer emerged from the cruiser, a weary young man with sharp features and a smug grin. That made Darius's blood simmer. His name tag read Tobias Grant. He sauntered over, leaning against the hood of Darius's car as if this were all some amusing game. Running red lights, speeding, Tobias drawled, pulling a notepad from his pocket and flipping it open with exaggerated care. "You're just piling up the charges, huh?" Darius's patience snapped like a frayed thread. "Call St. Mary's Hospital," he said, his voice sharp and commanding despite the tremor of exhaustion beneath it. "They'll tell you who I am. They'll tell you there's a patient waiting for me, little girl who's dying while you waste my time." Victor let out a low, humorless chuckle, shaking his head as water streamed from his cap. "We've heard it all before, surgeons, firefighters, secret agents. You're not special." The rain pounded harder, soaking Darius's clothes until they clung to his skin. But it was the officer's indifference that chilled him most. His heart thundered with a mix of fury and helplessness, every lost moment a dagger twisting deeper. "I'm not lying," he said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "A little girl's life depends on me, and you're standing here playing power games." Victor exchanged a glance with Tobias, who shrugged as if the situation were mildly entertaining. "Save the sob story for the judge," Victor said, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt with a casual flick of his wrist. "What are you doing?" Darius demanded, his voice rising above the storm as panic clawed at his throat. The cold metal snapped around his wrists, biting into his skin with a cruel finality. "You're under arrest for reckless endangerment," Victor replied, his tone as nonchalant as if he were ordering coffee. "You can't do this," Darius shouted, his voice raw and desperate as the officers shoved him toward the cruiser. "If she dies, it'll be on you." Victor leaned in close, his smirk widening into something almost predatory. "Then I guess you'd better hope someone else saves her," he said, his breath hot against Darius's ear despite the frigid rain. The back door of the patrol car slammed shut behind him, trapping him in a cage of wet leather and unyielding steel. As the cruiser pulled away, leaving his own vehicle abandoned on the roadside, Darius stared out at the blurred world beyond the window. The rain streaked the glass like tears, but his mind was a furnace of determination. Somehow, someway, he had to get to that hospital. This wasn't just a race against time anymore, it was a war against the arrogance of those who wielded power without thought, and he refused to let Sophia pay the price for their blindness. Inside the cruiser, Victor Kane drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, the rhythm erratic and impatient as the rain continued its assault on the windshield. In the back seat, Darius sat rigid, his cuffed hands dripping water onto the upholstery, his soaked clothes clinging to him like a second skin. The air was thick with tension, a palpable current that crackled between the three men. Tobias Grant, slouched in the passenger seat, turned to glance at Victor, his earlier smirk fading as he caught the hard set of his partner's jaw. "You really think this guy's some hotshot surgeon?" Tobias asked, his voice threaded with doubt as he chewed on the end of his pen. Victor snorted, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "They all have a story. Grant saves lives, feeds the poor, fights crime on weekends until you dig a little deeper and find the cracks." Darius couldn't stay silent. "Why don't you call St. Mary's?" he said, his voice cutting through the drone of the engine. "They'll tell you exactly who I am and why I'm out here in this mess, instead of safe at home like you two." His words were a challenge, a plea wrapped in defiance. But Victor didn't even glance back. "That's cute," the officer said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think you can just snap your fingers and we'll jump? That's not how this works, buddy." "Buddy," Darius's voice rose, his frustration boiling over like a pot left too long on the flame. "You don't have the faintest idea who I am or what's at stake. A little girl is dying right now, and instead of helping me save her, you're hauling me off like I'm some petty thief. Are you really this blind, this full of yourself?" Victor slammed on the brakes, the sudden jolt throwing Darius forward against the seat in front of him. The officer turned slowly, his eyes glinting with a cold, dangerous edge as they locked onto Darius. "Listen here," he said, his voice low and menacing, each word deliberate. You might be used to people bowing and scraping in some fancy hospital, but out here, on this road, I'm the one in charge. You don't get to talk to me about arrogance." Tobias shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his notepad as the air grew heavy. "Maybe we should, I don't know, check his story," he muttered, his bravado wavering. "What if he's telling the truth?" Victor's head snapped toward his partner, his glare sharp enough to cut glass. "And what if he's not? What if he's just another self-important ass who thinks he's untouchable?" In the back, Darius clenched his jaw, his wrists chafing against the cuffs as the minutes bled away. Sophia didn't have time for this, for their egos, their petty power plays. "Officer Kane," he said, his voice dropping to a steely calm that belied the storm raging inside him. "I don't care if you believe me. What I care about is that you're holding a life in your hands right now, and you're too stubborn to see it. You're going to regret this, I promise you that." Victor's jaw twitched, a muscle jumping beneath the skin as he turned back to the road. The cruiser lurched forward, tires splashing through puddles as they rolled toward the precinct. The fluorescent lights of the station loomed ahead, harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. Victor yanked Darius from the car with a rough grip, marching him inside as Tobias trailed behind, his earlier swagger replaced by a flicker of unease. The precinct buzzed with the low hum of late-night activitaphones ringing faintly, the clatter of keyboards, the murmur of tired voices. Darius's shoes squeaked against the linoleum, leaving a trail of rainwater in his wake as Victor steered him toward a holding area. The cuffs dug deeper into his wrists, a constant reminder of the absurdity of his situation. He was a healer, a man who'd dedicated his life to pulling others back from the brink. And now he was shackled like a criminal while Sophia's heartbeat grew fainter by the second. But Darius couldn't know that the man dragging him through this nightmare would soon face a reckoning of his own. Victor Kane, so certain of his authority, was driving headlong into a truth that would shatter his world. The little girl fighting for her life was his own daughter, Sophia. And as the clock ticked relentlessly onward, the threads of fate were tightening, weaving a tapestry of justice and consequence that neither man could escape. This was no longer just a story of survival. It was a brutal lesson in the cost of unchecked power, a testament to the resilience of a man pushed to his limits, and a stark reminder that even the smallest abuses of authority could ripple outward, threatening the innocent. For Darius, every moment in those cuffs was a battle not just to save a life, but to expose the flaws in a system that had turned its back on him. And for Victor, the road ahead promised a bitter awakening, one that would force him to confront the humanity he'd so carelessly dismissed. The air at the booking desk hung heavy with tension, thick enough to taste, as Captain Harris loomed over the scene like a storm cloud ready to burst. A towering figure, his broad shoulders stretched the seams of his uniform, and his moustachettons and bristling seemed to carry its own authority. A perfect match for the oversized ego that fueled his every word. Harris was the sort of man who didn't just command a room, he crushed it beneath his boot, relishing the chance to remind everyone who held the reins. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, flicked toward the man standing before him, a flicker of curiosity dancing beneath his usual disdain. "Who's this one?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, glancing at Darius with the mild interest one might spare a stray dog. Victor, standing rigid beside the suspect, answered with a clipped tone that barely masked his irritation. "Caught him running a red light, speeding like a bat out of hell. Says he's some kind of surgeon on a mission to save the world." The words dripped with skepticism, and Victor's lips twitched as if he'd just told a punchline he didn't expect anyone to believe. Harris arched a bushy eyebrow, his face a canvas of amusement and doubt. "That's so?" he drawled, turning his full attention to Darius. The man didn't waver. Darius stood tall, his jaw set, meeting Harris's piercing stare head-on, his dark eyes burning with a quiet intensity that seemed to unsettle the room. Inside, his heart thudded not from fear, but from the ticking clock he could feel in his bones. "I don't claim to be anything," he said, his voice steady, each syllable deliberate. "I am a surgeon, and if you don't let me walk out of this station right now, a little girl is going to die. Her name's Sophia Kane. Does that ring any bells?" For a fleeting moment, Harris paused, the weight of the name settling over him like an unexpected chill. His mind churned, sifting through the possibility that this wasn't just another desperate story spun by a cornered man. Then, as if shaking off a bothersome thought, he let out a dry, humorless chuckle that echoed off the precinct's drab walls. Sophia Kane, huh? Sounds like something straight out of a daytime drama. What do you take us for, fools? Victor and Tobias, lingering nearby like shadows, exchanged uneasy glances before letting out nervous laughs, the kind that teetered on the edge of discomfort rather than genuine mirth. But Dryas wasn't laughing. His chest tightened, frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior as he leaned forward, his voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "I think you're a pack of cowards," he snapped, his words sharp enough to draw blood. "You'd rather puff up your chests and play power games than admit you might be wrong. Too scared to pick up a phone and check my story because you know I'm telling the truth." The room went still, the air sucked out as if Dryas had flipped a switch. Harris's smirk vanished, replaced by a glare so cold it could have frosted the windows. His lips parted, and his voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "You've got a mouth on you, don't you? We'll see how chatty you are in a cell." With a curt nod, he signaled Victor, who seized Dryas's arm with a roughness that betrayed his own rattled nerves, dragging him toward the back of the station where the holding cells waited like silent sentinels. But before they could cross the threshold, a shrill ring shattered the tension. Slicing through the murmurs and heavy footsteps, it came from the desk phone. Insistent and unyielding, Harris strode over, his irritation etched into every line of his weathered face as he snatched the receiver. "What is it?" he barked, his tone a whip crack. Then something shifted. His expression faltered, the annoyance draining away to reveal a flicker of something darkered out, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of dread. He glanced at Victor, then Tobias, before his gaze settled on Dryas, who stood defiant despite the grip on his arm. "You've got to be kidding me," Harris muttered into the phone, his voice barely audible. "Fine, I'll handle it." He slammed the receiver down, the sound reverberating like a gavel, and turned to Victor with a tightness in his jaw. "Officer Kane," he said, each word clipped and heavy, "I just got a call from St. Mary's Hospital. They're looking for a Dr. Wells." Victor's face froze, his breath catching, as if someone had punched him square in the gut. Tobias, usually quick with a smug quip, paled, his eyes darting to the floor. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor whispered, echoing Harris's disbelief, though his voice trembled with something far more personal. Harris exhaled, a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his years in command. "They say a little girl named Sophia Kane is dying, and this guy's the surgeon they need. Ring any bells, Kane?" His tone was pointed, a jab wrapped in exasperation. Victor didn't move at first, his mind reeling as the pieces crashed together. Sophia Kane wasn't just an Amit, was his name, his blood, his daughter. The realization hit him like a freight train, splintering his composure. His heart plummeted, a sickening lurch that left him dizzy, and his grip on Dryas's arm loosened until his hand fell away entirely. Tobias shifted awkwardly beside him, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet unease, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve as he avoided Victor's gaze. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Victor demanded, his voice cracking, raw with a mix of fury and fear. Dryas's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying but his resolve unshaken. "Does it sound like a joke?" He shot back, his tone low and cutting. Victor whirled on Harris, his hands curling into fists so tight his knuckles whitened. "How long ago did they call? How bad is she?" His voice trembled, teetering on the edge of desperation. Harris met his gaze, unflinching. "Does it matter if this guy's telling the truth? Your kid's running out of time." The words hung there, blunt and brutal, stripping away any pretense. The room seemed to hold its breath, the walls closing in as Victor turned to Dryas, his eyes, wide and wild, shimmered with a desperation he couldn't hide. "You have to save her," he said, his voice barely a whisper, fragile as glass. Dryas didn't flinch, his stare unwavering. "Then uncuff me and get me to the hospital. Now." Victor hesitated, his mind a battlefield. Every instinct screamed at him to follow protocol, to cling to the rules that had defined his career, his identity. But this wasn't just another suspect. This was the man who held his daughter's life in his hands. His chest heaved as he wrestled with the choice, the seconds stretching into an eternity. "Victor, make a call," Tobias muttered, his voice shaky, stripped of its usual cockiness. "We're running out of time." Victor's hand hovered over the handcuffs, trembling as the weight of his daughter's life bore down on him. "Please," he finally said, the word breaking as it left his lips. "Just save her." But the question lingered, unspoken yet deafening. Would he bend the rules for a man he'd just arrested? Or would his indecision doom Sophia to a fate he couldn't bear to imagine? Victor Kane stood rooted to the spot, the keys to the handcuffs glinting in his palm like a cruel taunt. His mind raced, a chaotic swirl of duty and dread. He'd built his life on being the officer who followed the book, who never wavered, never bent. But now, staring into the abyss of losing his child, those rules felt like chains dragging him under. Darius Wells glared at him, his composure a stark contrast to the storm raging around them, his dark eyes boring into Victor with a mix of impatience and defiance. Tobias Grant lingered nearby, his usual swagger replaced by a quiet discomfort that gnawed at him. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze flickering between the floor and the scene unfolding before him, as if he wanted to vanish into the cracked linoleum. The precinct buzzed with a tension so thick it pressed against their skin, a living thing that threatened to suffocate them all. "What are you waiting for?" Darius snapped, his voice sharp but controlled, a surgeon's precision in every word. "Every second you stand there, Sophia slips closer to death. Do you want her blood on your hands?" Victor flinched, the mention of her name a dagger to his chest. He glanced at Harris, who stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. The captain's silence was a judgment all its own, a test Victor wasn't sure he could pass. "I can't just," Victor began, but the excuse died on his tongue, sounding hollow even to himself. "Yes, you can," Darius cut in, his voice rising with urgency. "And you will. Or do you plan to keep flexing your badge while your daughter dies waiting for me?" Tobias cleared his throat, his discomfort spilling over. "Victor, maybe we should." Harris raised a hand, silencing him mid-sentence. "Enough of this soap opera," he growled, his patience worn thin. "Follow protocol. If this guy's so vital, let the hospital send another surgeon." "There's no other surgeon," Darius shouted, stepping forward despite the cuffs biting into his wrists, his voice cracked with frustration, a rare break in his iron resolve. "I'm the only one who can do this. If you don't let me go, she'll die." Victor's chest tightened, his breath shallow as the truth sank in. It wasn't just Darius's words, it was the cold, unyielding reality staring him down. Tobias spoke again, softer this time, his bravado gone. "Captain, this isn't protocol anymore. This is different." Harris shot him a withering look. "And what happens if we're wrong? What happens if this guy runs, and we're left explaining to internal affairs why we let a suspect stroll out the door?" "You're kidding, right?" Darius hissed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You think I'd bolt? You think saving a life is some elaborate con? God, you people are unbelievable." Victor's breathing grew ragged, his eyes darting between Darius, Harris, and the clock on the wall. Its hands moved relentlessly, each tick a mocking reminder of time slipping away. "Fine," he rasped, his voice hoarse with surrender. He grabbed the key, stepping toward Darius with a resolve that felt more like desperation. "But if you try anything to nothingly regret it." Darius's glare didn't soften. "You've already made me regret every second I've wasted here." Victor unlocked the cuffs, the metal clinking as they fell away. Darius rubbed his wrists, his eyes sweeping over the officers with a defiance that dared them to stop him. Harris stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "This is a mistake, Kane." He growled, "You know it, and I know it. If this goes sideways, you're finished." Victor didn't answer. He grabbed his coat, his movements jerky and unsteady, and gestured for Darius to follow. "Let's go." Outside, the night had erupted into chaos. Rain lashed down in sheets, a relentless torrent that turned the streets into rivers. The wind howled, a primal scream that rattled the precinct's windows and bent the trees lining the road. Victor's patrol car sat beneath the harsh glare of a flickering streetlight, water pooling around its tires like a moat. "Get in," he barked, yanking open the driver's door with a force that sent droplets flying. Darius climbed into the passenger seat, his soaked clothes clinging to him, the fabric dark and heavy against the worn upholstery. Tobias followed, sliding into the back without a word, his silence louder than any protest. The engine roared to life, and Victor slammed the accelerator, the tires spinning uselessly for a heartbeat before catching the slick pavement. "We don't have long," Darius said, breaking the oppressive quiet. "The longer she waits, the harder it'll be to stabilize her." Victor didn't respond, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, the rain-slicked streets stretching out before him like a gauntlet. The patrol car's sirens wailed, cutting through the storm and parting the sparse late-night traffic. In the back, Tobias finally found his voice, though it trembled with uncertainty. This isn't going to end well, is it?" Victor's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. "Not now, Grant." But Tobias pressed on, his words tumbling out in a rush. "We're breaking every rule in the book for this guy. What if we're wrong? What if this blows up in our faces?" Darius turned in his seat, his expression hard as stone. "You think this is about you? About your precious rules, and how it'll look on your record? A child's life is hanging by a thread, and all you can think about is covering your own ass." "Enough," Victor snapped, his voice a gunshot that silenced the car. The only sounds left were the hum of the tires on wet asphalt, and the blaring siren piercing the night. Darius leaned back, his gaze fixed ahead, and murmured, "5 minutes, that's all we have." Victor's stomach churned, a nauseating twist of fear and guilt. 5 minutes to cover 10 blocks in a storm that turned the world into a blur of water and shadow. 5 minutes to rewrite the consequences of his hesitation. 5 minutes to prove that justice wasn't just a badge he wore, but a choice he could make even if it meant tearing down the walls of power he'd hidden behind for so long. The rain pounded harder, as if the sky itself demanded an answer, and Victor pushed the car forward, racing against time, fate, and the fragile hope that he wasn't already too late. The night stretched on endlessly, each moment laced with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself might snap. The stakes weren't merely steep, they were a towering, insurmountable wall, pressing down on the 3 men caught in this unrelenting storm. They had no options left, no paths to retreat down. Ahead, the hospital loomed into sight, its silhouette cutting through the darkness like a fragile promise of salvation. The neon sign above the entrance flickered erratically, casting jagged bursts of light against the sheets of rain that battered the windshield. Victor Kane gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled ferocity, his breath shallow and uneven as he yanked the patrol car into the emergency bay. Tires screeched against wet asphalt, the vehicle fishtailing for a heartbeat before lurching to a stop with a jolt that rattled their bones. Darius Wells didn't wait for the engine's growl to fade. The second the car steadied, he flung the door open and leapt out, his boots splashing into a shallow puddle as he bolted toward the hospital's entrance. His heart thundered in his chest, a frantic drumbeat drowning out the storm's roar. The automatic doors parted with a sharp hiss, swallowing him into the chaos of the emergency room. Inside, it was a whirlwind of noise and motion nurses shouting clipped commands, monitors blaring their insistent warnings, the sharp tang of antiseptic clawing at his nostrils. Darius's eyes darted through the blur of white coats and gurneys, his focus razor-sharp despite the exhaustion gnawing at his edges. "Where's Dr. Clark?" A nurse's voice pierced the din, her tone edged with desperation as she wrestled with a clipboard. Darius stepped forward, his presence cutting through the frenzy like a blade. "I'm here," he said, his voice steady as steel, unshaken by the chaos swirling around him. "Get me prepped for surgery. Now." The nurse froze mid-step, her gaze snapping to him as recognition flared in her wide eyes. "Dr. Wells, thank God. She's ready in OR2. Her vitals are crashing fast." Without a flicker of hesitation, Darius strode past her, disappearing into the sterile depths of the hospital, leaving the clamor of the air behind like a fading echo. Back in the waiting area, Victor Kane and Tobias Grant stood stranded amidst the storm they'd stumbled into. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting harsh shadows across their faces. Tobias shifted his weight, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the linoleum floor. "What now?" he murmured, his voice so soft it barely rose above the distant hum of machinery. Victor didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the double doors where Darius had vanished, his mind a churning sea of dread and doubt. Every muscle in his body was taut, coiled tight with a tension he couldn't shake. Inside those doors, Darius was gearing up to wage war against death itself, fighting to pull Sophia Canavictor's daughter back from the brink. But out here, beyond the reach of scalpels and sutures, another conflict simmered, one Victor wasn't sure he could face. His chest ached with a familiar, suffocating weight, a ghost of the terror he'd felt 7 years ago when Sophia had come into the world too soon. Her tiny body tethered to machines that beeped and whirred like a mechanical lifeline. Back then, he'd been powerless, a spectator to her fragile struggle. Now, that same helplessness clawed at him again, sharper and more bitter, because this time, it was his own choices that had brought them to this edge. Tobias's voice cut through the fog of Victor's thoughts, jagged and unsteady. "You think he's gonna pull it off?" Victor's jaw tightened, his breath catching as he forced air into his lungs. The badge pinned to his chest felt like a lead weight, dragging him deeper into the guilt that gnawed at his core. Tobias fidgeted beside him, his lanky frame hunched with unease, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against his thigh. He seemed capable, Tobias ventured, his tone softening as if he were trying to convince himself as much as Victor. "If he's the real deal, she's got a shot, right?" Victor turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Tobias's with a look so hollow it seemed to swallow the light around them. "It's not about whether he's capable," he said, his voice low and rough, each word scraping against his throat. "It's about whether I held him up too long, whether I made it too late." The confession hung heavy between them, a dark, unyielding shadow that silenced Tobias instantly. Neither man moved, the weight of Victor's words pressing down like the storm outside. Inside Operating Room 2, Darius scrubbed in with a precision honed by years of practice, his hands moving in a ritualistic dance under the rush of water. The surgical team buzzed around him, their faces tight with strain, their eyes flicking nervously to the monitors where Sophia's vitals pulsed in erratic, fading lines. "She's not stabilizing," a nurse whispered, her voice trembling as she hovered near the table, her gloved hands clutching a tray of instruments. The beeping of the heart monitor grew more frantic, a staccato cry echoing through the sterile room. "She will," Darius replied, his tone a quiet command that brooked no dissent. Scalpel, his mind was a fortress, every distraction locked out, every ounce of fury and exhaustion walled off behind an iron resolve. There was no space for the sting of betrayal he'd felt earlier that night, no room for the resentment that burned toward Victor Kane for dragging him into this mess. There was only Sophia, her small, fragile form sprawled on the table, her life hanging by a thread he refused to let snap. As he took the scalpel, the room seemed to still, the air itself holding its breath. Each cut was deliberate, each movement a defiance of the chaos threatening to claim her. The team moved with him, a silent symphony of trust and urgency, their faith in him unspoken but absolute. Outside, Victor paced the hallway like a lion trapped in a cage, his boots thudding against the tiled floor in a restless rhythm. Every 30 seconds, his eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, its hands crawling forward with agonizing slowness. Time stretched into a tortuous eternity, each tick amplifying the storm raging in his chest. Tobias slumped in a plastic chair nearby, his earlier jitteriness replaced by a heavy, resigned silence. His thin fingers twisted together in his lap, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the night had settled there. Rain lashed against the windows in relentless waves, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within. Victor's phone buzzed sharply in his pocket, snapping him out of his spiraling thoughts. He fished it out, his pulse spiking as he saw Captain Harris's name flash across the screen. His thumb hesitated, hovering over the button, before he finally pressed it and brought the phone to his ear. "What?" he snapped, his voice a jagged edge of frustration and fatigue. "I could ask you the same damn thing," Harris shot back, his growl crackling through the line. "What the hell are you doing, Kane? You let the suspect go. Have you lost your mind?" Victor's grip tightened around the phone, his knuckles whitening as he stepped into a shadowed corner of the waiting area, away from Tobias's watchful eyes. "He's not a suspect," he hissed, his words dripping with defiance. He's the only surgeon who can save my daughter." Harris's response was a snarl of disbelief. "And you didn't think to mention that before you let him waltz into a hospital unguarded? You've compromised everything, Kane. I hope you're ready for the fallout." Victor's free hand balled into a fist, his nails biting into his palm. "I don't give a damn about the fallout," he spat, his voice trembling with barely contained fury. "If she dies because I wasted time cuffing him, that's on Menat, not Tobias me." Silence stretched on the other end, thick and heavy, before Harris let out a low, bitter chuckle. "You think this is just about you? You've got no idea what you've unleashed. Internal affairs is up my ass now. If this goes south, it's not just your badge on the line, mine too." Victor's jaw clenched, but he ended the call without another word, shoving the phone back into his pocket with a force that made his hand ache. Anger seared through him, tangled with a guilt that gnawed at his bones like a living thing. In the operating room, Darius's hands moved with a mechanical grace, his focus unyielding even as Sophia's heart rhythm faltered, dipping into a perilous silence that made the monitors scream. "We're losing her," a nurse gasped, panic creeping into her voice as she fumbled with a suction tube. "No, we're not," Darius snapped, his eyes never leaving the incision, his tone a lifeline thrown into the chaos. "More suction." Now, the team responded instantly, their movements sensing with his like the gears of a well-oiled machine. Another precise cut, the faint rasp of the scalpel against flesh slicing through the tension like a whisper. Time lost all meaning here, each second an endless battle against the inevitable. But then, slowly, impossibly, the monitors began to shift, the weak, erratic beeps steadied, growing stronger, more insistent. The nurse who'd spoken earlier let out a soft, trembling breath, her eyes darting to Darius with a mixture of awe and relief. "She's stabilizing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Darius didn't flinch, didn't look up. "We're not done yet," he replied, but a faint thread of triumph wove through his words, a quiet victory snatched from the jaws of despair. Out in the hallway, Victor collapsed into a chair, his head dropping into his hands as the adrenaline drained from his body, leaving him hollow. Tobias sat beside him, the silence between them a thick, unspoken bond. Neither man spoke, their thoughts too knotted to unravel aloud. Finally, Tobias broke the quiet, his voice tentative but firm. "You did the right thing, letting him go." Victor let out a dry, humorless laugh, his hands still shielding his face. "The right thing. I arrested the man who was supposed to save my daughter. I burned time she didn't have." "How the hell is that right?" Tobias leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're here now," he said simply. "That's something." Victor shook his head, but before he could argue, the doors to the operating room swung open with a soft whoosh. Darius stepped out, his scrubs streaked with blood and sweat, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the physical. Victor surged to his feet, his heart slamming against his ribs. "Well, is she alive?" Darius cut in, his voice flat but resolute. "For now, she's stable, but the next 24 hours are critical. Don't thank me yet." Victor's shoulders slumped, relief flooding through him. Though it was tempered by the gravity of Darius's warning, he nodded stiffly, his throat too tight to form words. Darius turned to leave, but he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "I did my part, Kane. The rest is up to her and you." Victor watched him go, his mind a tempest of gratitude, regret, and a deeper, unnamed ache. As Darius stepped into the cold night air, the hospital doors slid shut behind him, muffling the chaos he'd left behind. His scrubs clung to his skin, damp with sweat and the drizzle that had replaced the earlier downpour. His breath clouded in the chilly air as he leaned against a concrete pillar, the adrenaline finally bleeding out of him. He'd saved Sophia Kane's life for now, but the weight pressing down on him was more than just the toll of surgery. It was the memory of hours earlier, when Victor Kane had yanked him from his car, the cuffs biting into his wrists, the humiliation of being treated like a felon instead of a healer. It was the bitter truth that this fight was far from over, that the consequences of Victor's misuse of power rippled far beyond this single night. The rain pattered softly around him, a quiet counterpoint to the distant hum of the city. Darius pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he stared at the screen. Knowing the storm waiting for him was only beginning, Victor remained in the hallway, staring at the spot where Darius had disappeared, his badge still heavy against his chest. Justice, he realized, wasn't just about rules or retribution, it was about the cost of every choice. The lives caught in the balance. He'd wielded his authority like a weapon, and now he stood in the wreckage, forced to confront the fallout. Tobias watched him silently, his own thoughts a quiet tangle of loyalty and unease. Outside, the rain slowed, but the air crackled with the promise of something bigger, a reckoning neither man could escape. For Darius, for Victor, for Sophia, this night was a brutal lesson. Power could save or destroy, and the line between the two was thinner than any of them had ever imagined. The rain had dwindled to a faint drizzle, a soft patter against the asphalt of the hospital parking lot, but the air still carried the weight of the storm that had raged all night. Darius stood beneath the faint glow of a flickering street lamp, his breath visible in the damp chill as he scrolled through his phone. His thumb paused over the voicemail Ikononi new message from a number he didn't recognize. A strange unease gnawed at his gut, an instinct he couldn't shake, like a shadow moving just beyond his sight. He tapped play, and a distorted voice rasped through the speaker, low and urgent, as though the speaker feared being overheard. "They know who you are, and they don't care. They'll come after you for this. Get out now, before it's too late." His heart lurched, a cold jolt racing through his veins. He replayed it, pressing the phone closer to his ear, desperation creeping in as if the second listen might unravel the mystery. But the words remained the same, cryptic, menacing, and utterly unfamiliar. The voice was a ghost, unplaceable, its warning sinking into him like ice water. For a moment, he stood rooted to the spot, the phone trembling slightly in his hand as he stared at the screen. Was this a prank, a threat, or something far darker? The hiss of the hospital's automatic doors snapped him out of his trance, and he spun around, his nerves frayed. Tobias Grant stepped into the night, his silhouette framed by the sterile light spilling from inside. Rain clung to his coat, his dark hair plastered across his forehead, giving him the look of a drenched, uncertain boy rather than the confident man Darius knew him to be. "Doctor Wells." Tobias's voice wavered, tentative, as if he feared the response he might get. Darius's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the phone as he shoved it into his pocket. He wasn't in the mood for this now. Tobias took a cautious step forward, hands buried deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the drizzle. "I just wanted to thank you for saving Sophia." His words hung in the air, fragile and earnest, but they only stoked the fire simmering in Darius's chest. "Spare me the gratitude," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the damp night. "I didn't do it for you or Kane." Tobias flinched, a flicker of hurt crossing his face, but he didn't back down. "Look, I get it. You've got every reason to hate us right now. I didn't think. Darius's voice sliced through the air, raw and unyielding. He took a step closer, his eyes blazing with a fury he could barely contain. "That's the problem, Tobias. Neither of you thought. You played your games, abused your power, and a little girl almost died because of it. Sophia's blood would have been on your hands if I hadn't been there. Don't stand there pretending you're sorry now." Tobias's mouth opened, a protest forming. But before he could speak, a new voice cut through the tension. "Grant." Victor Kane's tone was sharp, commanding attention as he strode toward them from the shadows of the lot. His face was a mask of grim resolve, his trench coat flapping slightly in the breeze. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze darting between the two men, suspicion etching lines into his weathered features. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice low but edged with authority. "Nothing," Darius said icily, folding his arms across his chest. "Just your partner trying to scrub his conscience clean." Victor's eyes narrowed, but he let the jab slide, his focus locking onto Darius with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "We're not done," he said, his words deliberate, each one landing like a stone. Darius tilted his head, his brows furrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Victor hesitated, his jaw working as if he were wrestling with how much to reveal. "You're going to be called in for questioning." The words hit Darius like a punch, and he barked out a laugh short, bitter, and devoid of humor. "You're kidding me, right? After everything I've been through tonight, you still think I'm the problem?" Victor's expression didn't waver, though his voice tightened. "It's not up to me, Wells. Captain Harris isn't letting this go. You disobeyed orders, put lives at risk." "Put lives at risk?" Darius's voice rose, incredulity and rage colliding as he stepped closer, closing the gap between them. "I saved a life, your daughter's life, Victor. Or have you already forgotten that while you're busy covering your own ass?" Victor's face darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes, but he held his tongue. Tobias, sensing the tension spiraling, stepped between them, his hands raised in a feeble attempt at peace. "Let's all just take a breath here." "Don't," Darius snapped, his glare cutting to Tobias like a blade. "Don't you dare act like the voice of reason now. You don't get to play that card." Victor exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. "I'm trying to help you, Wells. Whether you believe me or not, Harris is looking for a scapegoat, and you're the easiest target. He's already drafting the report. If you're smart, you'll cooperate." Darius stared at him, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, the weight of Victor's words sinking in. Justice, it seemed, was a twisted gameon where the innocent were punished and the guilty shielded themselves behind badges and bureaucracy. Finally, he stepped back, shaking his head in disgust. "You've done enough, Kane," he said quietly, his voice laced with venom. "Stay out of my way." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and stalked off, his boots thudding against the wet pavement, the sound echoing in the stillness. Victor watched him go, a knot tightening in his chest. For once, he couldn't fault Darius's anger. Every word the man had spat was true. Victor and Tobias had wielded their authority carelessly, and the consequences had nearly been catastrophic. Beside him, Tobias shifted uncomfortably, his shoes scuffing the asphalt. "He's not wrong, you know," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the drizzle. Victor shot him a sidelong glance, irritation flaring. "I don't need a lecture, Grant. I'm just saying," Tobias pressed, his tone growing bolder, "if Harris pushes this, it won't just be Wells who burns. You think he'll protect us if this blows up in the press? He'll toss us to the wolves without a second thought." Victor's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together. He knew Tobias was right. Harris was a master at self-preservation, and they'd all seen him sacrifice others to save his own skin. Admitting it, though, felt like choking down shards of glass. Meanwhile, Darius reached his car, yanking the door open and slamming it shut with a force that rattled the frame. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the steering wheel, the voicemail looping in his mind like a haunting refrain. "They'll come after you for this. Get out now, before it's too late." Who were they? And why did it feel like the storm he'd battled all night was only the prelude to something worse? He turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, and caught a flash of headlights in his rearview mirror. His stomach twisted as he squinted into the glare of a familiar patrol car, rolled into the lot behind him. Victor stepped out, his figure a dark silhouette against the blinding lights, and approached with slow, deliberate steps. He rapped on the driver's side window, and Darius rolled it down just enough to let his voice carry. "What now?" Victor's face was unreadable, his tone hushed but firm. "You need to be careful. Harris isn't the only one watching you anymore." Before Darius could demand an explanation, Victor turned and walked back to his car, vanishing into the shadows. The cryptic warning lingered, thick and oppressive, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Darius gripped the wheel, his knuckles whitening, his mind racing. Who else was watching? Why now? Before he could piece together the fragments, another set of headlights flickered on across the lot. An engine growled, and a car crept forward, its dark shape shrouded by the rain-streaked windshield. His chest tightened as it idled behind him, its lights piercing his mirror. Was this a coincidence here, Victor's warning already unfolding? By the time Darius reached his apartment, the mysterious car had disappeared into the night, but the unease clung to him like damp clothes. The storm had quieted to a murmur, yet the city felt alive with tension, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the next move. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, the dim hallway swallowing the sound of his footsteps. At his door, he froze, hairs on his neck prickling. It wasn't fully closed. He'd locked it that morning, was certain of it, but now a sliver of darkness yawned between the frame and the wall. His pulse quickened as he scanned the empty hall, every shadow suddenly a threat. Slowly, he nudged the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The faint glow of his living room lamp spilled across the floor, but the silence inside was suffocating, the kind that hinted at a presence lying in wait. "Hello," he called, his voice steady despite the dread clawing at him. No answer. He stepped inside, his breath shallow, senses heightened as he moved through the small space. The kitchen was untouched, the bathroom dark and empty. Then he turned to his bedroom. The door was closed, though he'd left it open that morning. His hand closed around a heavy bookend from a nearby shelf, its cold weight steadying him as he approached. With a swift push, he flung the door open. Muscles coiled for a fight. The room was empty, but the window gaped wide, curtains fluttering in the breeze. Someone had been here. He crossed the room into strides, slamming the window shut and locking it, his mind spinning. Who would break in and take nothing? Was this tied to the voicemail, the headlights, Victor's warning? His phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. He fumbled for it, sweat slicking his palms. The screen lit up with a new message from that same unknown number. "Are you home yet, Doctor?" Wells, a chill raced down his spine, anger surging through the fear. He typed back, fingers trembling. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "You'll know soon enough." Before he could respond, a sharp knock at the door made his heart leap into his throat. Still clutching the bookend, he crept forward and peered through the peephole. Victor Kane stood there, his expression graver than ever. Darius cracked the door open, his voice like ice. "What now?" Victor's eyes met his, heavy with unspoken weight. "We need to talk." The rain had stopped, but the air still hung heavy with dampness as Victor stood outside Darius's apartment door, his voice barely rising above a hoarse whisper. "Can I come in?" he asked, exhaustion threading through every syllable. His hair, dark and slick with moisture, clung to his forehead as he dragged a trembling hand through it, the weight of the night pressing down on him like a lead shroud. Darius, standing rigid in the doorway, clutched the edge of the door so tightly his knuckles whitened, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "And why the hell should I let you in?" He shot back, his tone sharp, cutting through the stillness of the dimly lit hallway. Every muscle in his body screamed defiance, but beneath it, a flicker of unease. Dan said, wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Victor let out a slow, burdened sigh, his breath fogging faintly in the cool air. "Because you're not safe, Darius," he said, his voice low but insistent, carrying the gravity of a man who'd seen too much. "Whoever's behind this, they're not done. Not by a long shot." His words hung there, heavy and ominous, sinking into the cracks of Darius's resolve. For a moment, Darius didn't move, his grip tightening on the book, and he'd grabbed instinctively a blunt, heavy thing that felt like his last tether to control in a night spiraling out of his grasp. But then, reluctantly, he stepped aside, letting the door creak open wider. Victor slipped inside, his boots leaving faint wet prints on the hardwood floor, his eyes darting around the cramped apartment with the precision of a predator scanning for threats. Tension coiled in his shoulders, his every movement deliberate, as if he expected the shadows themselves to lunge at him. Darius shut the door behind him, the soft click of the latch sounding louder than it should have in the suffocating silence. "Someone was here," he said flatly, his voice stripped of emotion, though his heart thudded unevenly in his chest. He watched Victor like a hawk, searching for any crack in the man's guarded demeanor. Victor froze mid-step, his head whipping toward Darius so fast it was as if the words had struck him physically. "Here," he repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief, "as in inside your apartment." His eyes widened briefly, betraying a flash of fear he quickly smothered. But it was enough for Darius to catch. "Yeah," Darius said, his tone hardening as he recounted the scene that had greeted him when he'd stumbled home earlier. The front door was cracked open just enough to notice. The bedroom window, unlocked, the latch dangling like someone didn't care if I figured it out. And then this. He thrust his phone toward Victor with a jerky motion, his fingers trembling not from cold but from a simmering rage he could barely contain. The screen glowed with a single text message, its words stark and chilling. Victor took the phone, his jaw clenching as he read, the lines of his face deepening with every passing second. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered, almost to himself, his voice rough with a dread he couldn't hide. "What do you know?" Kane, Dryas demanded, stepping closer, his broad frame looming as frustration clawed at his chest. "You show up here with your cryptic warnings, acting like you're doing me a favor, but you've got no answers. Either start talking, or get the hell out of my place." His words crackled with pent-up fury, his patience fraying like a rope stretched to its breaking point. Victor hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the window, a quick, nervous tick that didn't escape Dryas's notice. The city beyond the glass was a blur of muted lights and wet streets, but Victor stared as if he could see something lurking there, just out of reach. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "I think Harris is just a piece of this, a small one. Someone bigger, Simeon, with real power is pulling the strings, and they don't want this story getting out. Not about tonight, not about you." Dryas's brow furrowed, confusion warring with the anger bubbling inside him. "What do you mean? About me?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near growl. "What could they possibly want from me?" Victor hesitated again, his lips parting as if the words were stuck in his throat, and that pause ignited something feral in Dryas. "Spit it out, Kane," he snapped, his patience shattering like glass. Victor's eyes met his, steady but shadowed with something dark. "They're not just watching you," he said quietly, each word measured and heavy. "They're digging into your past, your career here, everything. Harris is feeding them whatever he can scrape up, and now they're trying to scare you into silence. Whoever they are, they don't want you talking about what happened tonight." Dryas's eyes narrowed to slits, his mind racing as he pieced together the implications. "Because I saved your daughter," he said slowly, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "After you damn near got her killed. That's a hell of a story to bury." His voice dripped with bitterness, the memory of that chaotic night flashing through his mind. Screams, the blood, the desperate rush to pull Victor's little girl from the wreckage. Victor didn't flinch, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. "It's not just about her," he said, his tone flat but edged with urgency. "If this gets out, people will start asking questions. About us, about the department, about everything. And there are people, powerful people, who don't want that kind of scrutiny." Dryas stared at him, his thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief and dawning horror. "So you're saying this is a cover-up?" he asked, his voice trembling with the weight of the accusation. Victor nodded, his expression grim, his eyes hollowed by a truth he wished he could unsee. "And they'll do whatever it takes to keep it quiet." Before Dryas could press further, a low rumble cut through the Tensiona car engine, idling just outside the building. Victor moved to the window into quick strides, peering through the blinds with a face that darkened like a storm cloud rolling in. "What is it?" Dryas asked, his grip on the bookend tightening until his knuckles ached. Victor stepped back, his voice dropping to a whisper so faint it barely reached Dryas's ears. "We need to go, now." There was no room for argument in his tone, only raw, primal instinct. Dryas didn't hesitate to snatch his keys from the counter, the metal cold against his palm, and followed Victor to the door, his pulse hammering in his throat. As they stepped into the hallway, Dryas cast one last glance back at his apartment, the sanctuary that now felt like a trap. His phone buzzed again in his pocket, an insistent vibration against his hip, but he ignored it. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the stairwell below, steady and deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. Panic clawed at his chest as they sprinted down the hall, the dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead like a dying pulse. The stairwell's noise swallowed boots on concrete, a rhythm that spoke of pursuit, of intent. Dryas's breath hitched, his lungs burning as he and Victor froze in the shadowed corridor. Victor raised a hand, his fingers splayed in a silent command for stillness, his body taut as a bowstring drawn to its limit. "Stay behind me," he whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of Dryas's own heartbeat. "Behind you," Dryas hissed, his voice a mix of incredulity and anger. "You're the one who dragged me into this mess." Victor ignored him, his hand sliding to the holster at his hip, his fingers curling around the grip of his gun with a practiced ease that spoke of years on edge. Peering down the hall toward the stairwell, Victor's jaw tightened as a shadow stretched across the landing below, a long, distorted silhouette that seemed to swallow the faint light. The door creaked open, slow and deliberate, and a man stepped into view. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the doorway, clad in a dark coat that drank in the dim glow of the hallway. A baseball cap shadowed his face, but his steps calm, unhurried, radiated a quiet menace that sent a shiver racing down Darius's spine. "Do you know him?" Darius whispered, his voice trembling despite his efforts to steady it. Victor didn't answer, his gaze locked on the stranger, every line of his body screaming readiness. The man stopped, his head tilting slightly as if he sensed their presence. Then he spoke, his voice smooth and cold as ice over a frozen lake. "Dr. Wells." The sound of his name in that stranger's mouth jolted Darius like a live wire, his body recoiling instinctively until his shoulder brushed the wall behind him. Victor stepped forward, his hand now fully gripping his firearm, the barrel glinting faintly in the low light. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "What do you want?" The man raised his hands slowly, palms out in a gesture that should have been disarming, but instead felt like a predator, baring its teeth. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said, his tone to calm, to controlled. "I just want to talk to the doctor." Victor didn't lower his weapon, his eyes narrowing as he sized the man up. "Funny way of asking for a chat," he said, his words laced with suspicion. "You've been following him, haven't you?" The man tilted his head again, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Following, no. Protecting, maybe." Darius's frown deepened, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to voice. "Protecting from what?" he asked, stepping out from behind Victor despite the officer's hissed protest. The man's gaze shifted to him, and though the cap hid his eyes in shadow, the weight of his stare was a tangible thing, pressing against Darius's chest. "From the people who'll come for you next," the man said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're standing on the edge of something bigger than you can imagine, Doctor." Victor took another step closer, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Cut the cryptic bullshit and explain yourself, or I'll assume you're one of them." The man chuckled softly, his breath visible in the cool air, a sound that carried no warmth. "I'm not your enemy, Kane," he said, his voice steady. "In fact, if you're smart, you'll listen to me, both of you." Victor's grip on his gun tightened, his knuckles whitening. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. The man's smirk faded, his posture shifting subtly. "I know a lot of things," he replied smoothly, "but the clock's ticking. Every second we stand here, you're more exposed. You need to leave." "Now, exposed to what?" Darius snapped, his fear giving way to a desperate need for answers. "Who are these people, and why are they after me?" The man's jaw tightened, a flicker of something regret, perhaps crossing his shadowed face. "Because you saw something you weren't supposed to," he said, "and if you don't move, they'll make sure you never get the chance to tell anyone." Victor glanced at Darius, his eyes wild with a mix of doubt and urgency. The pieces didn't fit. Not yet, but the raw edge in the man's voice was impossible to dismiss. "How do we know you're not leading us into a trap?" Victor asked, his suspicion a thick undercurrent in his words. The man took a step closer, lowering his hands with a deliberate slowness. "You don't," he said simply, "but if I wanted you dead, I wouldn't be standing here talking. Decide follow me, or stay and face what's coming up those stairs." The footsteps resumed, louder now, accompanied by the murmur of multiple voices drifting up from below. Victor cursed under his breath, his resolve cracking as he motioned for Darius to move. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight. Darius opened his mouth to argue, but the words died as the sounds from the stairwell grew more insistent, boots pounding, voices overlapping in a low, menacing hum. He didn't need more convincing. The man turned without another word, striding down the hallway with a swift, purposeful grace. Victor followed, his hand never leaving his holster, while Darius trailed behind, his reluctance warring with the primal instinct to survive. They slipped out through a side exit into the alley behind the building, the air biting and damp, the ground slick with puddles that shimmered under the faint glow of a street lamp. "Where are we going?" Darius demanded, his breath puffing out in short. ragged bursts as they hurried down the narrow passage. "Somewhere safer than here," the man replied curtly, his voice clipped as he kept his eyes forward. Victor stopped abruptly, grabbing the man by the shoulder and spinning him around with a force that made the air crackle. "Enough," he growled, his face inches from the stranger's. "If you want us to trust you, start talking. Who are you, and what do you know about this?" The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to the alley's entrance as if expecting shadows to materialize. "My name's Mason," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I used to work for the same people who are after you now." Darius felt a cold knot twist in his stomach, his breath catching as the weight of those words sank in. "You mean Harris?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mason shook his head, his expression darkening. "Harris is just a pawn. I'm talking about the ones behind him, the ones pulling his strings." Victor's eyes narrowed, his grip on Mason's shoulder tightening. "And why should we believe a damn word you say?" he demanded. Mason's gaze hardened, a flicker of defiance breaking through his calm facade. "Because I was one of them," he said, his voice raw with a truth that cut deep. "I know how they think, how they operate, and I know that if you don't disappear soon, they'll make you disappear permanently." Before Victor could respond, the faint screech of tires on wet pavement echoed from the alley's mouth, a sound that sliced through the night like a blade. Mason's head snapped toward it, his body tensing. "They're here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Move." The three of them broke into a sprint, the sound of approaching vehicles swelling behind them, a relentless roar that drowned out the thudding of their footsteps. Darius's lungs burned as they raced through the twisting backstreets, his legs pumping against the uneven ground, fear and adrenaline driving him forward. Behind them, headlights flared, cutting through the darkness like twin blades, their glow chasing them down the alley. "Faster!" Mason barked, veering sharply into another passage, his coat flapping like a dark wing in the wind. Darius stumbled, his foot catching on a jagged edge of pavement, but he pushed on, the terror of the unknown spurring him into the night. In that moment, as they fled through the labyrinth of shadows, Darius understood that this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice, about the consequences of power wielded without restraint, of truths buried beneath layers of corruption. And as the headlights grew brighter, the realization settled into his bones. Some would kill to keep those truths silent, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. The night air was thick with tension as Darius Wells stumbled over the uneven pavement, his shoes scraping against the jagged edges of loose gravel. His lungs burned, each breath a ragged, desperate gasp that echoed in his ears. Suddenly, Victor Kane's iron grip clamped onto his arm, yanking him upright with a force that jolted his entire body. "Come on," Victor's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and insistent, leaving no room for hesitation. Darius barely had time to steady himself before the world erupted into Modionte. Chase was on, and whatever was coming for them wasn't about to let them slip away without a brutal fight. Behind them, the roar of engines swelled into a deafening crescendo, a mechanical beast snarling through the darkness. Headlights sliced through the night, their blinding beams bouncing wildly off the grimy alley walls, swallowing the shadows in their relentless advance. Darius's pulse hammered in his chest, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out everything but one chilling realization. Whoever was behind those lights wasn't just chasing them, they were here to end it. His mind raced, grasping for clarity amid the panic, but all he could feel was the cold grip of dread tightening around his heart. Mason, leading the trio, veered sharply into a narrow passage, his movements swift and deliberate despite the strain etched into his weathered face. The alley was a claustrophobic squeeze, barely wide enough for a person to slip through, let alone the monstrous vehicles hunting them down. "Keep moving," Mason barked, his voice taut but steady, a lifeline in the chaos. Darius stumbled again, his legs trembling beneath him as he fought to keep pace. This wasn't his world. His battlegrounds were sterile operating rooms, where precision and split-second decisions meant life or death. Out here, in the dead of night, running for his life through a labyrinth of backstreets, he was a stranger lost in a nightmare. Victor stayed close, his presence a constant pressure at Darius's back, his hand shoving him forward with unyielding determination. "Don't stop, move." Victor's command was a growl, laced with urgency. Darius clenched his jaw, forcing his aching muscles to obey even as they screamed for respite. The relentless growl of engines suddenly fell silent, replaced by the sharp, unmistakable crunch of boots slamming against pavement. "They're on foot now," Victor hissed, his dark eyes flicking toward Mason with a mix of frustration and calculation. "How far are we from wherever the hell you're taking us?" "Not far," Mason shot back, his tone clipped but resolute. "If we keep moving, we can make it." Before Darius could process the words, a piercing crack split the air, a gunshot, raw and vicious, reverberating through the alley. Instinct took over, and all three men dove for cover. Darius flattened himself against the damp, gritty wall, his heart pounding so fiercely he thought it might burst. Another shot rang out, the bullet striking the brick inches from his head, sending a shower of sparks and dust into his face. "They're shooting at us," he rasped, his voice cracking with a terror he couldn't suppress. "Welcome to the party," Victor muttered, his tone dry but edged with steel. He drew his firearm, peering around the corner with a predator's focus. Two quick shots erupted from his gun, the muzzle flashes casting fleeting glimpses of his grim, unshakable resolve. "Keep going," Mason shouted, already ducking low and sprinting deeper into the alley. Victor hauled Darius to his feet, half dragging him as they followed Mason through the twisting maze of backstreets. The sounds of pursuit clung to them like a shadow, boots pounding, voices barking orders, the occasional crack of gunfire slicing through the night. Finally, Mason skidded to a stop before a rusted metal door at the rear of a crumbling warehouse. His fingers danced over a keypad hidden behind a loose brick, punching in a code with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this 100 times. "Hurry it up," Victor snapped, firing another shot into the darkness as their pursuers' footsteps grew louder, closer. The door hissed open with a groan, and Mason shoved Darius inside. Victor followed, slamming it shut just as the sound of boots reached the other side, a thunderous echo of intent. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the sour tang of mildew. A single bulb dangled overhead, its weak light casting long, eerie shadows across the concrete floor. Darius's chest heaved as he fought to catch his breath. "Are we safe here?" he demanded, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. "For now," Mason replied curtly. Crossing to a table in the corner, he pulled out a laptop and a stack of manila folders, his movements brisk and purposeful. Victor locked the door with a heavy clank, then turned to Mason, his face a storm of barely contained fury. "You need to start explaining right now. Who are those people, and why are they after him?" Mason leaned against the table, his expression darkening into something cold and unreadable. "They're professional hired muscle working for the same people pulling Harris's strings. If they'd caught us, Wells wouldn't be walking out alive." Darius's stomach lurched. "Why do they want me dead?" he demanded, his voice rising with a mix of anger and disbelief. Mason opened a folder and slid a grainy photograph across the table. Darius took it, his brow furrowing as he studied the image, a man lying on a gurney, pale and lifeless, in what was unmistakably a hospital operating room. "This man died 2 weeks ago during surgery," Mason said, his voice low and deliberate. "A simple procedure that should have been routine, but something went catastrophically wrong." Darius looked up, confusion swirling in his mind. "What does this have to do with me?" Mason pointed at the photo. His name was Thomas Crowley, CEO of Crowley Biotech. "The people who worked for him don't think his death was an accident. They believe someone tampered with his medical records, and they're convinced you know who." Darius blinked, stunned into silence. "I've never even heard of Crowley Biotech, let alone Thomas Crowley. Why would they think I'm involved?" Mason's gaze was unflinching. "Because your name popped up in the hospital system the same day Crowley was admitted. You were flagged as a specialist they consulted. Someone in their organization decided you're either part of it or know too much. That's insane." Darius snapped, his voice breaking. "I don't even remember being consulted on a case like that." Victor leaned over Mason's shoulder, frowning as he scanned the folder. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't about what Darius knows, it's about what they think he knows. That makes him a loose end, and people like this don't leave loose ends." Mason nodded, his face grim. "Exactly." Darius ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, his thoughts spiraling. "This is absurd. They're willing to kill me over a mistaken assumption over a patient I've never even met. Mason's expression hardened. It's not just about Crowley. His death set off a chain reaction, something bigger they want buried. If they're coming after you, it means they're tying up every thread before it unravels. Victor crossed his arms, his gaze sharp and piercing. So what's the plan? You dragged us here, know what? Mason turned to his laptop, fingers flying over the keys. I've got a safe house we can move to, but we'll have to be careful. They're tracking everything: phones, credit cards, even your car. If we leave here, we leave it all behind. Darius stared at him, a sickening weight settling in his gut. You want me to disappear? Just vanish? What about my career, my life? Mason's response was brutal in its simplicity. What life? You stay visible. You're dead. Victor glanced at Darius, his expression unreadable but heavy with truth. He's right. This isn't about what's fair, it's about survival. Darius opened his mouth to protest, but a faint metallic clink from outside froze the words in his throat. Victor's hand shot up, his body tensing. What was that? Mason crept to the window, peering into the inky blackness. A second clink followed, closer now. Deliberate. They found us, he whispered, his face draining of color. Victor drew his firearm, motioning for Darius to stay low. How many exits? One, Mason replied, his voice tight. Victor cursed under his breath. That's not enough. Darius's chest constricted, adrenaline flooding his veins. He thought of Sophia Kane, lying fragile in a hospital bed, a life he'd fought to save. Now, he was the one dangling on the edge of oblivion, and salvation seemed impossibly far away. The silence shattered with a violent crash. The door trembled as something heavy slammed into it, splintering the wood at the edges. Don't move, a voice barked from the other side, cold and commanding. Mason lunged for the table, yanking a compact handgun from a drawer. Get behind cover, he hissed. Victor was already in motion, his gun trained on the door, while Darius stood paralyzed, his back pressed against the icy concrete wall. His mind screamed at him to act, but his body refused, rooted by fear. Wells, Victor roared. Get down now. Another deafening blow struck the door, a hinge snapping with a sickening crack. Shadows danced across the threshold, elongated and ghostly in the dim light. Darius dove behind a steel cabinet just as the door exploded inward, shards of wood flying like shrapnel. 3 men stormed in, their faces hidden behind black masks, their movements precise and lethal. Hands up, one of them shouted, his voice a blade cutting through the air. Victor answered with a roar of his own, his gun blazing. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in stark, fleeting bursts as a bullet tore into one intruder's shoulder, sending him crashing to the floor with a guttural cry. In that moment, the weight of Justiciar's absence pressed down on Darius like a physical force. These men, these shadows, were tools of power run amok, chasing a lie that had spiraled beyond reason. Crowley's death, a single thread, had unraveled into a tapestry of corruption and consequence, and Darius was caught in its knots. The lesson was brutal and clear. When power is abused, it doesn't just destroy, it consumes everything in its path, leaving no room for truth, only survival. The air trembled with the thunderous roar of gunfire as Mason's voice sliced through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Pain, stay low, he bellowed, his fingers tightening around the grip of his pistol as he squeezed off to rapid shots. The bullets streaked toward the shadowy figures of the remaining assailants, their forms barely discernible through the haze of smoke and violence that engulfed the room. The sound was deafening, a relentless barrage of sharp cracks that reverberated off the chipped plaster walls, amplifying the terror of the moment. Darius Wells clung to the edge of a dented metal cabinet, his body pressed so tightly against it that he could feel the cold steel biting into his skin. His heart hammered in his chest, a wild, erratic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to rival the gunfire. Every beat pulsed with a raw, primal fear, drowning out the world around him as he fought to steady his ragged breathing. Peering out from his hiding spot, his eyes widened in horror as he caught sight of a masked man hurling something small and cylindrical into the center of the room. It hit the ground with a dull clatter, rolling briefly before coming to a stop. Grenade! Mason's shout pierced the air, his voice thick with urgency as he dove behind an overturned table. his movements swift and instinctual. Darius didn't think couldn't. His body reacted before his mind could fully register the danger, propelling him across the room in a frantic scramble toward the far corner. He threw himself down, curling into a ball and shielding his head with his arms just as a blinding flash erupted. The explosion followed an instant later, a bone-rattling boom that shook the walls and sent a shockwave rippling through the space. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, the world tilting violently as he struggled to anchor himself in the disorienting aftermath. Dust and debris rained down around him, coating his throat with a gritty bitterness as he coughed and blinked against the sting in his eyes. When his vision finally cleared, the room was a haze of thick, choking smoke, the sharp tang of burnt metal searing his nostrils. Through the fog, Victor Kane's voice cut like a blade, steady despite the madness. "Are you hit?" he called out, his tone laced with a quiet intensity that betrayed his concern. "No," Darius rasped, his voice barely a croak as it clawed its way out of his parched throat. He swallowed hard, wincing at the dryness that scraped against his vocal cords. Mason emerged from behind his makeshift barricade, coughing as he wiped sweat and grime from his brow. "We've got to move," he said, his words clipped and urgent. "They'll trap us like rats if we stay here." Victor nodded in agreement, his jaw set as he fired another shot toward the assailants, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating his stern features. The remaining attackers flinched but held their ground, their silhouettes shifting in the gloom. "Where's the back exit?" Mason asked, his eyes darting around the room until they landed on a rusted steel door tucked into the far wall. "That way," he said, gesturing sharply. "But we've got to carve a path through them first." The masked men moved with chilling precision, their steps quick and coordinated as they regrouped. One of them barked into a radio clip to his shoulder, his voice a garbled snarl lost in the cacophony of the fight. Darius couldn't make out the words, but the implication sent a shiver racing down his spine. "They're calling for backup," Victor growled, his grip tightening on his weapon as he scanned their surroundings. "We're running out of time." Mason turned to Darius, who still crouched in the corner, his face pale and streaked with sweat. The older man's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, but his voice remained firm. "You're the priority, Doctor. If they get their hands on you, this whole thing's finished. Stick close to me, and don't stop moving no matter what." Darius nodded, his throat constricting as a wave of dread washed over him. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't built for this relentless storm of violence. He was a man of science, thrust into a nightmare where survival was the only currency that mattered. Yet here he was, forcing himself to his feet, his legs trembling but resolute. Victor squeezed off another shot, the sound ringing in Darius's ears as he motioned sharply. "Go, I'll cover you." The three of them broke into a desperate sprint toward the steel door, their boots slamming against the cracked concrete floor with a rhythm born of sheer adrenaline. One of the masked men lunged from his position, his weapon raised and glinting ominously in the dim light. But Mason was faster. His pistol barked twice, each shot striking true. The assailant crumpled to the ground with a choked gasp, his body hitting the floor in a lifeless heap. "Keep moving," Mason roared, slamming his shoulder into the door and wrenching it open with a groan of protesting metal. They stumbled out into the night, the frigid air hitting them like a slap, sharp and biting against their flushed skin. The alley beyond was a narrow, shadowed trench, flanked by towering buildings that loomed like silent sentinels. The distant hum of the city, a blend of car horns and muted voice, drifted faintly through the stillness, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd just escaped. "This way," Mason said, taking the lead as he barreled down the alley at a relentless pace. Behind them, the shouts of their pursuers grew louder, punctuated by the heavy thud of boots pounding the pavement. "They're right on us," Victor warned, casting a quick glance over his shoulder. His dark eyes narrowed as he spotted movement in the distance, dark shapes closing in fast. Mason's gaze flicked to a side street branching off ahead, its entrance shrouded in shadow. "Cut through there," he said, his voice taut with determination. "It'll buy us some time." Darius's lungs burned with every ragged breath, his legs screaming in protest as he pushed them beyond their limits. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going, his body teetering on the edge of collapse. But the crack of gunfire behind them, sharp and merciless, spurred him onward. a cruel reminder that stopping wasn't an option. They veered into the side street, the dim glow of a flickering street lamp casting eerie shadows across the cracked asphalt. Mason slowed, his chest heaving as he scanned the area for threats, his pistol still clenched tightly in his hand. "We need to split up," he said suddenly, his tone urgent and unwavering. Darius's head snapped up, his breath catching in his throat. "What?" he gasped, his voice trembling with disbelief as he struggled to process the words. "It's the only way to throw them off," Mason explained, his eyes locking onto Darius's with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "They're tracking you, Doc. If we stick together, we're a glaring target begging to be hit." Victor stepped forward, his broad shoulders squared as his voice dropped to a steely edge. "Absolutely not. We stay together. If they catch him alone, it's over. And if they catch all of us, it's still over," Mason shot back, his patience fraying as the distant shouts grew closer. "This isn't up for debate. Wells, you go with Kane. I'll draw their fire." Victor's face darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "No way," he said, his tone colder than the night air. But Mason wasn't listening. He shoved a crumpled map into Victor's hands, his expression grim and unyielding. "There's a safe house marked here. Get him there and don't stop for anything." Before Victor could argue further, Mason turned and sprinted back down the alley, firing a single shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed through the night, a deliberate taunt to lure their pursuers away. "Damn it," Victor snarled, his fist clenching around the map as he grabbed Darius by the arm. "Come on, let's go." They tore through the winding streets, the city's glow fading as they plunged deeper into the industrial district. The air grew heavy with the stench of oil and rust, the faint hum of machinery rumbling in the distance like a restless beast. Victor's grip on Darius's arm was ironclad, his strength practically dragging the exhausted doctor forward when his steps faltered. "We're almost there," Victor said, though a thread of uncertainty wove through his words, betraying the confidence he tried to project. Darius couldn't respond, his chest heaved with every labored breath, his mind a swirling tempest of fear, exhaustion, and a gnawing realization. These people, whoever they were, didn't just want him. They were willing to tear the world apart to claim him, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. But as they rounded another corner, the shriek of tires pierced the air, freezing them in place. Headlights flooded the narrow street ahead, harsh and unrelenting. As a dark SUV barreled toward them with predatory intent, the vehicle skidded to a halt, its tires spitting water across the fractured pavement. The doors flew open in unison, and 3 men emerged, their movements crisp and deliberate, like wolves circling their prey. The street lamp overhead flickered ominously, casting jagged shadows across their masked faces. Victor reacted instantly, shoving Darius behind a rusted dumpster with a force that sent him sprawling. "Stay down," he growled, drawing his gun in one fluid motion, his stance radiating a fierce resolve that dared the enemy to test him. Darius pressed himself against the dumpster's cold, grimy surface, his breath coming in shallow. Panic bursts, his hands trembled as he peeked out, his heart sinking as he took in the scene. There was no escape now, no more alleys to duck into, no more chances to outrun the inevitable. This was the endgame, a brutal standoff they couldn't avoid. "Dr. Wells," one of the masked men called out, his voice smooth and sinister, carrying a chilling calm that seemed to mock the night itself. "You've run far enough. Make this easy and come with us." Victor fired a warning shot, the sound splitting the air as it echoed off the brick walls. "Not happening," he spat, his eyes blazing with defiance. The leader tilted his head, unfazed by the gunshot. "You think you can protect him, Officer Kane? You don't even know who you're up against." Victor's lip curled into a snarl, his gun steady as he aimed at the man's chest. "I don't need to know. All I care about is that you're not taking him." The leader chuckled a low, hollow sound that sent a chill racing down Darius's spine. Bold words for a man outmatched and outgunned. Victor fired again, the bullet striking the ground inches from the leader's boots, kicking up a spray of dust. "You want him? Come and get him." The response was swift and merciless. The masked men unleashed a hail of gunfire, the deafening roar filling the street as bullets tore through the air. Victor dove behind a stack of splintered wooden pallets, returning fire with precise, Controlled bursts. The air thickened with smoke and the acrid bite of gunpowder, but Victor's focus never wavered, his every move a testament to his training and resolve. Darius flinched with every shot, his hands gripping the dumpster's edge so tightly his knuckles ached. His mind screamed at him to flee, to find some way out of this hell, but his body refused to move. He was trapped, a spectator to his own fate. Victor's gun clicked empty, and he cursed under his breath, fumbling for the spare magazine at his belt. The masked men advanced, their steps deliberate and unyielding, closing the distance with terrifying calm. "Wells, listen to me," Victor shouted, his voice cutting through the din as he slammed the fresh magazine into his weapon. "If I say run, you run. Don't look back, just go." Darius shook his head frantically, his voice trembling as he choked out, "I'm not leaving you here." Victor's eyes flashed with frustration. "You don't have a choice," he snapped, leaning out from his cover to take aim. But before he could fire, a blinding light flooded the street, accompanied by the growl of an approaching engine. The masked men faltered, their heads whipping toward the source as a battered van screeched to a halt between them and their prey. The side door slid open with a groan, revealing Mason, his face etched with exhaustion and grim determination as he leveled a shotgun at the attackers. "Get in," he yelled, his voice hoarse but commanding. Victor didn't hesitate to seize Darius by the arm and hauled him to his feet, half dragging him toward the van as bullets ricocheted off the pavement. Mason's shotgun roared, the blast forcing the masked men to scatter for cover. Darius stumbled into the vehicle, collapsing onto the floor in a heap as Victor leaped in behind him, slamming the door shut with a resounding clang. "Go," Victor shouted, and the driver floored the accelerator. The van lurched forward, tires screeching as it sped away from the chaos. Mason fired one final shot out the window, the deafening boom echoing in the confined space before he ducked back inside, slamming the shotgun down beside him. Darius lay sprawled on the floor, his chest heaving as he stared up at the van's rusted ceiling. His mind reeled, grappling with the weight of what had just happened and what it meant. These men, these relentless pursuers, wielded power with a recklessness that left no room for mercy. But in their pursuit, they'd sown the seeds of their own reckoning. Justice, Darius realized, wasn't just a lofty ideal, it was a force, raw and unyielding, forged in the crucible of consequence. And as the van sped into the night, he knew that force was far from finished with them all. The van careened through the night, its tires screeching against the asphalt as it barreled down the claustrophobic streets. Inside, the air thrummed with tension, thick enough to choke on. Mason's knuckles whitened around the edge of his seat, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack. "They're chasing us," he rasped, his voice taut with a mix of dread and resolve, eyes darting to the rear window where the glow of headlights loomed closer. Victor, pressed against the van's swaying wall, let out a bitter scoff. "You think," he muttered, his sarcasm a flimsy shield against the rising panic gnawing at his gut. Every jolt of the vehicle sent a fresh wave of adrenaline surging through him, his hands gripping the metal frame as if it could anchor him to sanity. Darius, sprawled across the floor after being flung by the van's reckless swerves, dragged himself upright, his chest heaved, his heart a frantic drumbeat echoing in his ears. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes as he blinked through the haze of fear. "Who's driving this thing?" he demanded, his voice trembling with the strain of holding himself together. The driver's seat swiveled just enough to reveal a young woman, her sharp, unflinching gaze cutting through the chaos like a blade. Her name was Lena, and her composure was an anomaly, a calm island in a storm of desperation. "I'm Lena," she said, her tone steady as she flicked her eyes back to the road. "Mason called me in to pull you out of this mess." Victor's lips curled into a dry, humorless smirk. "Well, Lena, I hope you've got something up your sleeve, because those bastards aren't backing off." His words hung heavy as the van lurched into a brutal turn, hurling everyone sideways. Darius slammed into the wall, a grunt escaping him as he peered through the grimy back window. The dark SUVs loomed closer, their headlights slicing through the night like the eyes of relentless hunters, predatory and unyielding. Fear clawed at his throat, but he couldn't look away from the menacing shapes gaining ground. "They're not stopping," Mason growled, his hands steady as he slid fresh shells into his shotgun with a practiced click. "They'll smash us into the ditch if they get the chance." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much, a man who knew the cost of hesitation. Lena's grip tightened on the wheel, her knuckles pale against the worn leather. "Not if I shake them first," she shot back, her defiance a spark in the darkness. With a sudden jerk, she veered the van into a tighter alley, the sides scraping against rusted hulks of abandoned cars and scattered debris. The world outside blurred into a tunnel of shadows and metal, the van's frame shuddering as it squeezed through the narrow gap. Behind them, one of the SUVs misjudged the turn. Its fender caught the edge of a derelict sedan, and the night erupted with the shriek of twisting metal. The vehicle spun wildly, crashing into a crumbling brick wall in a burst of dust and sparks. "One down," Lena muttered under her breath, her lips twitching with grim satisfaction. "Two more to go," Victor added, his voice low and edged with unease as he tracked the remaining pursuers. Their headlights flared brighter, closing the distance with ruthless intent. Mason hauled himself toward the back of the van, his boots scuffing against the floor as he slid open a concealed panel in the rear door. A narrow slot revealed itself just wide enough for a barrel. He braced himself, shotgun in hand, his breath steadying as he waited for the perfect shot. The lead SUV surged forward, its grille so close it seemed to snarl at the van's bumper. Mason squeezed the trigger. The blast roared through the confined space, a deafening thunderclap that shattered the SUV's windshield into a spiderweb of glass. The vehicle veered sharply, plowing into a pile of rusted barrels with a sickening crunch. "Nice shot," Victor said, a flicker of admiration breaking through his guarded tone. Mason didn't flinch. "Don't get comfortable. The last one's not done yet." The final SUV roared louder, its driver a shadow of aggression behind the wheel. It weaved violently, left then right, probing for an opening to ram them off the road. Lena's eyes narrowed, her mind racing as she wrestled with the wheel. "Lena," Victor barked, his voice sharp with warning as the SUV edged closer. "I see it," she snapped, yanking the van hard to the left. The tires squealed as they skidded onto a desolate bridge, its skeletal frame stretching over a river that glinted black and cold. Under the sliver of moonlight, the SUV followed, its engine a guttural roar as it accelerated, intent on smashing them into oblivion. "They're going to ram us," Darius shouted, his voice cracking with terror as he braced himself against the floor. His hands trembled, his mind a whirlwind of disbelief at how his life had spiraled into this nightmare. "Not if I can help it," Mason snarled, leveling his shotgun again. The shot rang out, but this time it only grazed the SUV's hood. Sparking harmlessly against the metal, the bridge's end loomed ahead, marked by a jagged line of construction barricades. Lena's breath hitched. "Hold on," she yelled, wrenching the wheel to the right. The van swerved wildly, its side scraping the barricade with a scream of metal on metal. The SUV wasn't so fortunate. It plowed straight into the obstacle at full speed, flipping onto its side in a violent tumble, sparks flying as it skidded to a grinding halt. The van sped onward, the night swallowing the chaos behind them inside. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the ragged gasps of its passengers. Darius slumped against the cold floor, his body aching for rest, but his mind refused to quiet. "Did we lose them?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own pulse. "For now," Mason replied, sinking against the wall, his shotgun resting across his knees. Victor's gaze flicked to Lena, his expression a mix of suspicion and grudging respect. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, his tone sharp. Lena didn't flinch, her eyes locked on the road ahead. "And you've got a lot of thanking to do," she retorted, her voice cool and unshaken. The van screeched to a stop outside a crumbling warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the fractured pavement like broken promises. Lena killed the engine and turned to face them, her piercing gaze sweeping over their exhausted faces. "This is it," she said, her words clipped and final. "Your safe house for now." Darius forced himself upright, his legs trembling as the adrenaline drained away, leaving him hollow. His breath came in shallow bursts, his mind reeling with the realization that safety was an illusion. "Safe house," he murmured, his voice thick with doubt. They're not going to stop, are they? Mason kicked open the rear door, stepping out onto the gravel with a crunch that echoed in the stillness. No, they're not, he said, his tone heavy with certainty. Not unless we turn the tables. Victor climbed out next, offering Darius a hand as he stumbled onto the ground. Turn the tables? Victor asked, his brow furrowing. You think we're just going to hole up in this rat trap and wait for them to come back? They'll be here by dawn. Lena slammed the van door shut, her movements sharp and decisive. They don't know about this place, she interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. And if Mason's right, we've got a window to regroup. But if you want to hit them first, you'd better do it smart. Inside the warehouse, the air was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of rust and decay. The group gathered around a rickety table littered with blueprints, laptops, and crumpled maps, illuminated by a single buzzing bulb that dangled overhead. Its weak light carved a fragile circle in the oppressive gloom. Mason unfolded a map, his finger stabbing at a cluster of red marks. They've got operations spread out, but their nerve center is here. Crowley Biotech's off-the-grid facility. That's where the orders are coming from. Darius's voice wavered as he spoke, his hands curling into fists. Orders to kill me. Mason met his gaze, his eyes shadowed but unflinching. To silence you. You're a thread they can't afford to leave dangling. That place isn't just their headquarters, it's where they're stashing the proof. That could clear your name and burn them to the ground. Victor leaned over the map, his fingers tracing the lines with a scowl. And what are they, exactly? Mason's jaw tightened. Powerful, dangerous, willing to crush anyone to keep their secrets buried. Harris is just a puppet, a shield to keep the real players clean. They're untouchable unless we expose them. Darius's fists trembled, rage and helplessness warring within him. So I've been hunted, shot at, nearly run off the rodel because some suit up top is scared of what I know. I didn't sign up for this. Mason's voice softened, a rare crack in his armor. No one did. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, you're the only one who can make this right. The words settled over them like a shroud. Victor broke the silence, his tone hard as steel. If we hit that facility, it's going to get ugly. These people don't mess around. They've got firepower we can't match. Mason's eyes glinted with determination. We don't need to match them. We need to outthink them. We need evidence, something they can't sweep under the rug. Lena pulled a laptop closer, her fingers dancing across the keys until a blueprint flickered onto the screen. Here's their weak spot, she said, pointing to a storage wing on the compound's eastern edge. They keep physical records, their files, reports, backups. Get in, grab it, and we can bury them. Darius swallowed hard. And if we can't? Mason's face darkened. Then we're all dead. The next hour crawled by as they armed themselves with what little they had. Mason pressed a small handgun into Darius's shaking hands. You know how to use this? Darius shook his head, his stomach twisting. I'm a surgeon, not a fighter. Mason's grip tightened on his shoulder. You don't need to be. Just don't freeze if they corner you. Your life's on the line. Darius nodded, the weight of the weapon foreign and cold in his palm. Victor checked his own gun, casting a sidelong glance at Mason. You'd better be right about this. If it's a trap, I'm blaming you. Mason smirked faintly. Fair enough. Just make sure we get what we came for. The drive to the facility was a descent into silence, the van's engine humming like a heartbeat in the dark. The industrial sprawl gave way to dense woods, the road narrowing until it wound toward a fortress of steel and concrete, its high fences bristling with cameras. Lena stopped a quarter mile out, cutting the lights. This is as far as we go without being spotted, she whispered. They slipped into the underbrush, shadows among the trees, until the fence towered above them. Mason produced bolt cutters, snapping the links with quiet precision. No second chances once we're in, he breathed. Stick to the plan. They moved like ghosts through the compound, the silence broken only by the faint hum of perimeter lights. The storage wing was in sight when an alarm pierced the night, a wail that split the air and bathed the grounds in flashing red. Victor cursed under his breath, his pulse racing as the reality of their gamble sank in. Justice, he realized, was a brutal teacher, and the consequences of challenging power were about to crash down on them all. The night hung heavy over the desolate compound. a shroud of darkness pierced only by the faint flicker of distant lights. Mason crouched low, his breath shallow and ragged, a string of muttered curses slipping through his clenched teeth. His pistol gleamed faintly in the dim glow, already drawn, his grip tight with anticipation. Shadows danced in the periphery, elusive and menacing, their movements a silent promise of danger. "They found us," Lena's voice sliced through the tension, sharp and urgent, as she dove behind a crumbling stack of wooden crates, her heart pounding so fiercely she could feel it in her throat. The air crackled with the first gunshot as Mason squeezed the trigger, the sound reverberating through the stillness. A guard, caught mid-stride as he rounded the corner, crumpled to the ground with a muted thud, his startled cry swallowed by the night. Victor moved like a predator, his steps deliberate and fluid, his eyes narrowed with focus. He fired twice more, each shot a precise extension of his will, clearing the path ahead as if carving through the chaos with surgical intent. "Go," Mason bellowed, his voice rough with adrenaline, his arm jerking toward the storage room in a frantic gesture. Darius froze for a heartbeat, his mind racing, doubt flickering in his chest like a trapped bird. But the urgency in Mason's command jolted him into action. He sprinted toward the door, his boots pounding against the cracked concrete, his trembling fingers fumbling with the rusted lock. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his breath hitching as the mechanism resisted, then finally gave way with a reluctant groan. He shoved the door open, stumbling inside, the musty scent of old paper and stale air hitting him like a wall. The room stretched out before him, a labyrinth of towering filing cabinets and flickering computer terminals, their screens casting an eerie blue glow across the shadows. Darius's pulse thundered in his ears as he darted forward, his hands shaking as he scanned the faded labels, yanking drawers open with desperate force. Outside, the KS Swelligen fire popping like fireworks, shouts echoing off the walls, the sharp clang of metal against metal. "Hurry up, Wells," Victor's voice cut through the din, strained and barely audible, a lifeline pulling Darius back from the edge of panic. "I'm trying," he shouted, his throat raw, his fingers clawing at another cabinet. The drawer screeched as it slid open, and there it was, a folder labeled Crowley Case, Internal Review. His breath caught, a surge of triumph mingling with dread as he snatched it up, clutching it to his chest as if it were both a shield and a burden. Mason burst into the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted against the flashing lights outside, his face etched with a grim resolve that made Darius's stomach twist. "We've got company. Move." The words were a whip crack, spurring them into motion. They fought their way back through the compound, a blur of gunfire and desperation, the folder in Darius's grip growing heavier with every step, as though the secrets it held were seeping into his bones. Bullets whizzed past, splittering wood and pinging off rusted pipes, the air thick with the acrid sting of gunpowder. They reached the chain-link fence, tearing through it with a collective roar, their bodies piling into the waiting van in a tangle of limbs and ragged breaths. "Go, go, go," Victor's voice boomed, a primal shout that rattled the windows as Lena slammed her foot on the gas. The van lurched forward, tires screeching against the gravel, the sprawling compound shrinking into a chaotic speck in the rearview mirror. As they tore down the narrow, winding road, hours later, in the dim safety of the W house, exhaustion hung over them like a fog, thick and suffocating, yet laced with a fragile thread of relief. Darius set the folder on the table with trembling hands, the weight of it grounding him even as his mind spun. The worn wooden surface creaked under its presence, as if it too felt the gravity of what they'd uncovered. "You did it," Mason said, his voice low and steady, tinged with something of admiration, perhaps, or the quiet acknowledgement of a shared burden. He stood by the window, his silhouette rigid against the creeping dawn, his eyes tracing the horizon as if searching for the next threat. Victor slumped into a chair, his gun clattering onto the table with a dull thud, his shoulders sagging under the weight of fatigue. "It's not over," he muttered, his tone heavy with foreboding. "This is just the start, but we've got what we need." His fingers drummed absently against the table, a restless rhythm that betrayed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Darius stared at the folder, its edges frayed, its contents a Pandora's box of truths that pressed down on him with unrelenting force. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it never truly had been. It was a beast larger than any one of them. A sprawling web of corruption and power that stretched far beyond the grimy walls of that compound. As the first golden rays of sunrise slipped through the cracked blinds, painting the room in hues of hope and uncertainty, a realization settled deep within him. They had struck the first blow, peeled back the first layer of a festering lie. But the war loomed ahead, vast and unyielding. This was about more than survival, it was about justice, about the consequences that ripple outward when power is wielded without restraint. Every choice they made now would echo, a testament to their resilience, a demand for accountability in a world that too often turned a blind eye. Across the country, in the crisp morning light of Boston's FBI field office, Linda Martinez sat at her desk, her posture unwavering despite the fatigue tugging at her edges. Thin beams of sunlight filtered through the blinds, slicing across the scattered case files she pored over with relentless focus. At 32, she was a rising star, her sharp mind and unyielding determination having earned her accolades at Quantico, and a reputation that preceded her. The knock at her door was firm, purposeful, and she glanced up to see Special Agent in Charge Frank Bennett, his salt-and-pepper hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a thick manila folder cradled in his arms. "Got a minute, Martinez?" he asked, stepping inside with the measured gait of a man who'd seen too much yet refused to bend. She nodded, clearing a space on her desk, her curiosity piqued by the weight in his expression. "Of course, sir." Bennett settled into the chair across from her, placing the folder between them like an offering or a challenge. "We've got a situation in Millbrook," he began, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of unease. "It's a small town, about an hour west of here. On the surface, it's a straightforward money-laundering caselical businesses raking in profits that don't add up. A laundromat, a grocery store, a pizza joint." He flipped open the folder, spreading out photographs of unassuming storefronts, their facades so ordinary they seemed to mock the complexity beneath. "The local police have been sniffing around for months, but every lead dead ends. Something's off." Linda picked up a photo of Mario's Pizza, her fingers tracing the edges as she studied the cheerful signage, her mind already sifting through possibilities. "What makes this federal?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with intrigue. "The money trail," Bennett replied, sliding a sheet of financial data toward her, numbers sprawling across the page like a coded confession. "We've tracked similar patterns across 6 states. This isn't small time. Millbrook's a hub, crucial, maybe central." Linda's eyes lit up as she scanned the figures, her gift for spotting patterns kicking into overdrive. The transactions were meticulous, timed to slip past standard oversight, a dance of precision that screamed intent. "These aren't random," she said, almost to herself, her voice tinged with excitement. "They're too clean, too deliberate." Bennett nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's why I want you on this. You see what others miss. Your last 3 cases proved it." Pride flickered in her chest, but she kept her face neutral, professional. "Thank you, sir. But there's more, isn't there?" Bennett leaned back, his expression hardening. "The local PD isn't thrilled about us stepping in. They're tight-knit, proud, and some see this as meddling. You'll need finesse diplomacy." The lead detective, Steve Morris, is old school, 20 years on the force. Doesn't take kindly to outside interference. As he puts it, work with him, but don't let him push you out. This is your case. Linda nodded, already bracing herself for the pushback she knew was coming. She'd faced skepticism before her youth. Her gender, her relentless drive often made her a target. "I understand," she said, her mind spinning with strategies as she gathered the papers. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning," Bennett replied, standing and smoothing his tie. "Set up in Millbrook. Coordinate with their department, but stay independent. Weekly reports to Memor if something breaks. And Linda, trust your gut. It's never failed you." After he left, Linda lingered over the files, diving deeper into the puzzle. The more she read, the more certain she became that this was no ordinary scheme. The careful selection of businesses, the flawless timinjit reeked of something larger, something orchestrated. That evening, as she packed a suitcase in her modest apartment, Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Maria, dinner before you vanish into the wild?" Linda smiled, typing back, "Not undercover, just a temp gig. Yes to dinner." An hour later, they sat in their favorite diner, the hum of conversation and clinking dishes a comforting backdrop. Maria stirred her coffee, eyeing Linda with a mix of pride and worry. "So, they're sending you to bust small-town crooks," Linda smirked, picking at her fries. "It's more than that. This isn't some sloppy cash grab, it's calculated. I just don't know how deep it goes yet." Maria squeezed her hand across the table. "Be careful, okay? You get that look when you're onto something big. Don't forget to eat or call your favorite sister." Linda laughed. "You're my only sister." Before dawn, Linda loaded her car, opting for her own vehicle over a bureau-issued one to keep a low profile. The drive to Millbrook was quiet, the road stretching through misty fields and sleepy towns, giving her time to steel herself for what lay ahead. Millbrook greeted her with quaint Charmaine Street lined with shops, including the ones she'd come to unravel. Mario's Pizza buzzed with early customers, an oddity for the hour, and she filed it away as she parked outside the weathered brick police station. Inside, the desk sergeant's welcome cooled when she flashed her badge. "Special Agent Linda Martinez, FBI. I'm here for Officer Morris." His call was curt, his gesture toward the hallway grudging. Linda strode forward, feeling the weight of curious stares, her resolve hardening with every step. Justice demanded vigilance, and she'd be damned if she let pride or power bury the truth. In the sleepy town of Millbrook, the air carried a deceptive calm, broken only by the faint hum of daily life along Main Street. Officer Steve Morris sat behind his cluttered desk at the police station, a broad-shouldered figure whose barrel chest strained against his uniform. Now in his 50s, his thinning gray hair framed a weathered face, and a pair of reading glasses rested precariously on the tip of his nose, giving him the look of a man perpetually unimpressed. He didn't bother to rise when Linda Martinez stepped into his office, her polished shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, peering over the rims of his glasses. "Agent Martinez," he drawled, letting her title drip from his lips like an unwelcome guest he'd rather escort out the door. "I suppose you're here about those businesses on Main Street." His tone carried a weight of annoyance, as though her presence disrupted some unspoken rhythm he'd spent years perfecting. Linda stood tall, her posture unwavering, her dark eyes meeting his with a calm resolve. "That's correct," she replied, her voice steady and professional, though there was an edge of determination beneath it. "I've gone over the initial reports your department put together. You've laid some solid groundwork, I'll give you that." She paused, letting the compliment hang in the air, a subtle olive branch she hoped might soften the man's prickly exterior. Morris, however, leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking under his bulk, his expression unchanging. "Been keeping an eye on those places for months," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "Nothing solid enough for a warrant, though, not yet." "That's exactly why I'm here," Linda countered, reaching into her sleek leather briefcase to retrieve a stack of neatly organized papers. She placed them on his desk with a deliberate thud, her fingers lingering on the edges as if to emphasize their importance. "We've uncovered similar patterns popping up in other states. What you're seeing in Millbrook, it's not isolated. It's a piece of a much larger puzzle." Her words were measured, but there was a flicker of urgency in her eyes, a quiet plea for him to see beyond the borders of his small domain. Morris's lips twitched, a smirk threatening to break through as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "With all due respect, Agent," he said, dragging out the word respect until it sounded more like a taunt than a courtesy. "We know our town. These are local businesses, run by folks we've known for years. Not everything some grand conspiracy cooked up by the feds." His voice was gruff, laced with a defensiveness that made Linda's stomach tighten. She could feel the wall he was building between them, brick by stubborn brick. She held his gaze, unflinching. "I get where you're coming from, Officer Morris," she said, her tone softening just enough to signal she wasn't here to wage war. "But the evidence tells a different story. I'm not trying to steamroll your investigation," he wanted to build on it. "There's something bigger brewing in Millbrook, and I think, deep down, you suspect it too." Her words hung heavy in the room, and for a fleeting moment, She saw a shadow of doubt flicker across his face, a crack in his armored certainty. He studied her, his bushy brows knitting together, then let out a long, weary sigh. Fine. There's a small conference room down the hall. You can use it as your office. But my officers answer to me, not you, got it? Understood, Linda replied smoothly. I'll need full access to your files on those businesses, and I'd appreciate any insights your team can share. As she followed him through the station's narrow corridors to her temporary workspace, her mind churned with possibilities. She'd anticipated Resistanza Morris's territorial growl was as predictable as the sunrise bit. That brief hesitation when she'd pressed him about Millbrook's secrets, that was a thread worth pulling. He knew something he wasn't ready to admit, and Linda vowed to unravel it. Stepping into the cramped conference room, she set her laptop on the table and glanced out the window. Beyond the glass, Main Street stretched out in quiet innocence, its faded storefronts hiding a web of deceit. Somewhere in this unassuming town, millions of dollars were being washed clean, and she'd stop at nothing to expose it. 3 weeks later, Linda sat hunched over her makeshift desk, surrounded by a fortress of financial records, surveillance photos, and scribbled notes. The once bare wall had transformed into a chaotic tapestry of red strings and pinned documents, each thread tying one seemingly mundane business to another in a sprawling network of suspicion. The morning stillness shattered with a sharp rap on the doorframe. Officer Peter Cole, a lanky young man with an earnest face and a mop of sandy hair, poked his head in. Unlike most of the station's old guard, he'd welcomed Linda's presence with a shy curiosity, often lingering to ask questions about her methods. Agent Martinez, he said, his voice tinged with excitement as he held up a manila folder. You might want to take a look at this. Just got the bank records you asked for Sunshine Laundromat. Linda waved him in, shoving aside a pile of papers to clear a space. As she flipped through the documents, her pulse quickened. The numbers stared back at her. Bold and impossible, the laundromat was reporting coin deposits far beyond what its rusty machines could churn out. Check this out, she said, jabbing a finger at the page. They're logging 5 times more quarters than any comparable business. Their sizing always in perfect, rounded figures. Cole leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the data. Could be they're just doing really well, he offered, though his tone betrayed his skepticism. Linda shot him a sidelong glance, a faint smile tugging at her lips. A laundromat pulling in exactly $5,000 in quarters every 3 days? That's not a thriving business, that's someone getting sloppy with their cover. She stood abruptly, snatching her jacket from the back of her chair. I need to see this place for myself. The Sunshine Laundromat squatted between a dollar store and a quaint cafe, its peeling paint and flickering neon signs screaming neglect. From her vantage point across the street, Linda watched through her car window, pen-scratching notes as the minutes ticked by. In an hour, only for customers shuffled in and outwardly the bustling hub the records suggested. Yet the numbers claimed this rundown relic was a gold mine. She was jotting down her observations when a familiar patrol car rolled up beside her. Morris leaned out his window, his grizzled face etched with his usual disdain, doing some laundry. Agent Martinez, he quipped, his voice dripping with mockery. Linda kept her cool, her pen pausing mid-sentence. Just observing, she replied evenly. Funny how a failing business reports such robust profits, don't you think? His jaw tightened, a flash of something ganger, unease, crossing his features. Maybe you ought to watch where you aim those accusations, he said, his tone darkening. Folks around here don't take kindly to federal agents poking their noses where they don't belong. Before she could fire back, he gunned the engine and peeled away, leaving her with the sting of his words and a growing certainty. He was hiding something. Back in her office, Linda tacked another string to her wall. Alan Parker, the laundromat's owner, held shares in 2 other businesses she'd flagged at Mario's Pizza and Valley Grocersal, showing the same suspicious deposit patterns. Her phone buzzed. A text from an FBI contact in the Financial Crimes Unit. Check account transfers from First Millbrook Bank, March 15th to 22nd. She dove into the records, her breath catching as the pieces snapped into place. Large transfers from all 3 businesses flowed into offshore accounts. cleverly staggered to dodge scrutiny. But there was Moria recurring payment to Bradford Building Corp., a local construction firm. She was knee-deep in property records when Morris stormed in, his face flushed with fury, a crumpled paper clutched in his fist. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he bellowed. "You can't just pull private bank records without proper channels." Linda rose slowly, her voice icy calm. "I followed protocol, Officer Morris. I have federal authorization for every request." He stepped closer, towering over her desk. "This is my town," he growled. "You're crossing lines you don't understand." "No," she shot back, unflinching. "I'm doing my job. And I'm starting to wonder why these specific records have you so rattled." The air crackled with tension as they locked eyes, a silent battle of wills. Finally, he turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Watch yourself, Agent. Small towns don't forget." After he'd gone, Linda dialed her supervisor, Bennett, filling him in. "The construction angle's intriguing," he mused. "What's their tie-in?" "Still digging," she said. "But Bradford's snapping up properties left and right, paying way over market value. I think they're using the laundered cash to buy real estate." "Solid work," Bennett replied. "But tread carefully, Morris might be in deeper than you think." That night, Linda parked near Mario's Pizza, the glow of her dashboard casting shadows across her face as she watched the staff trickle out. At 11 p.m., a black SUV rolled up behind the restaurant. Two men climbed out, hefting duffel bags inside. She snapped photos, her camera's soft clicks punctuating the silence until she spotted Morris's patrol car, lurking in a nearby alley, its engine idling. He was watching too, but made no move to intervene. Her gut twisted. The next morning, she arrived to find her office door ajar, the lock scratched, her files rifled through. Nothing was gone, but the message was clear. She called Bennett, her voice tight. "They're nervous." "We're close. Need backup?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "If we swarm in, they'll vanish. Give me a few days to tie it all together." By noon, Officer Cole appeared, his youthful face clouded with worry. "Agent Martinez, people in town are talking. They say you're harassing local business owners, making up lies." Linda shrugged. "Let them talk. The evidence doesn't lie." She pulled up her photos of the SUV at Mario's, pointing to the screen. "Notice anything familiar?" Cole's eyes widened. "That's the SUV I've seen behind the station. Morris talks to the driver sometimes." "Exactly," Linda said, her voice hardening. "And now we know why he's been shadowing my every move." As the day wore on, her financial crimes contact flagged more transfers, bigger, bolder. A frantic scramble to move the money. They knew she was closing in. She was drafting a warrant when Morris returned, this time with the police chief in tow, a stern man with a clipped mustache. "Agent Martinez," the chief began, his voice formal. "Officer Morris has raised concerns about your methods. We're going to need to review your—" Linda cut him off with a steely gaze. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about the cost of power unchecked. A lesson Millbrook would learn one way or another. Linda Martinez stood tall in the cramped, dimly lit office, her posture unwavering despite the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. Her voice, though steady as she faced the chief, carried the weight of sleepless nights and unyielding resolve. "With all due respect, Chief, this is a federal investigation. You don't have the power to pull the plug on it." Her words hung there, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the stale atmosphere of the room. The chief shifted uncomfortably in his worn leather chair, his brow furrowing as if he could feel the ground slipping beneath him. Mara, standing off to the side with her arms crossed, let out a low, mocking chuckle that dripped with disdain. "Maybe not," she sneered, her lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "But we can damn well make sure none of our officers lift a finger to help you with your little witch hunt." Her tone was venomous, each syllable laced with the smug certainty of someone who believed they held all the cards. She turned on her heel, her boots scuffing the linoleum floor, and strode out with the chief trailing behind her, leaving Linda alone in the cluttered space that had become her war room. The door clicked shut, and Linda exhaled slowly, her breath trembling just enough to betray the storm of frustration brewing inside her. She reached for her phone, her fingers brushing against the cracked edge of her desk as she dialed Bennett. The line crackled to life, and his familiar voice cut through the static. "They're trying to choke the investigation," she said, her words clipped but steady. Mara's got the chief wrapped around her finger. Thinks I'm stepping on toes I shouldn't. On the other end, Bennett's tone was calm, measured. The kind of voice that could anchor you in a hurricane. "Stand your ground, Linda. I've got something coming your way. Check your email." Moments later, her laptop screen flickered to life, illuminating the room with a harsh blue glow. The email from Bennett loaded slowly, each second stretching into eternity as Linda's pulse quickened. When it finally appeared, she leaned in close, her eyes scanning the attached bank records with a hunger for truth. There it was, irrefutable proof, regular payments from Bradford Building Corp. to an account under Stephen Morris Consulting. The dates aligned perfectly, starting just as the money laundering operation had kicked into gear. A grim smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, a flicker of triumph amid the exhaustion. She rose from her chair, her movements deliberate as she crossed the room to her investigation wall, a chaotic tapestry of red string, photos, and scribbled notes. With a steady hand, she pinned up the new evidence, watching the web of corruption grow clearer with every connection. As night draped itself over Millbrook, the small town outside her window seemed to hold its breath. The streets below lay silent, bathed in the faint amber glow of streetlights, their stillness a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in Linda's mind. She stood there, staring out at the quiet, her reflection ghostly against the glass. Tomorrow loomed largely a meeting with the FBI's white-collar crimes division. This time, she wouldn't just have suspicions, she'd have receipts. Officer Morris might fancy himself a master of this twisted game, but he was about to discover that underestimating Linda Martinez was a misstep he'd regret deeply. The lesson was clear. Justice, when pursued with relentless precision, could unravel even the tightest knots of power. The next morning, the sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Linda pulled into the parking lot of a modest coffee shop 2 towns over from Millbrook. She'd chosen this spot with care, far enough to dodge the prying eyes of small-town gossips, yet close enough to keep her finger on the pulse of her case. The gravel crunched under her tires as she parked, her hands tightening briefly on the steering wheel before she stepped out into the crisp dawn air. Inside, Special Agent Diana Roberts waited at a corner table, her sharp features softened by the steam rising from her coffee cup. "You look like hell," Diana remarked, her voice dry but not unkind as Linda slid into the seat across from her. Linda managed a tired half-smile, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Small-town politics will do that to you," she replied, setting her laptop and a thick stack of files on the table with a soft thud. "But what I've dug up makes every sleepless night worth it. For the next hour." She laid out her case with meticulous detail, her voice growing stronger with each piece of evidence she revealed. The bank transfers glowed accusingly on her screen, property purchases mapped out in a spiderweb of deceit, and at the center of it Officer Stephen Morris. "Check this pattern," Linda said, sliding a spreadsheet toward Diana. "Every time Bradford Building Corp snaps up a property, there's a deposit to Morris's consulting gig 3 days later. Always 8% of the sale price, like clockwork." Diana leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she traced the numbers with a fingertip. A low whistle escaped her lips. "Kickbacks, plain as day." "But that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?" Linda nodded, her jaw tightening. "The real story's in the money's origin. I followed it through a maze of shell companies leads back to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Same accounts tied to our 3 target businesses." She flipped her laptop round, pulling up grainy photos of a laundromat, a pizza joint, and a corner grocery store. "These Plastair fronts, they're cleaning cash for someone with bigger fish to fry, someone with global reach, and Morris, he's their shield." Diana's gaze darkened, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the table. "Not just Morris. This kind of operation stinks of deeper rot in the department." Linda opened her mouth to agree, but her words died as her eyes caught a familiar sight outside the window, a patrol car cruising by. At a snail's pace, Morris's patrol car, miles from where it belonged. Her stomach twisted. "We're being watched," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Diana didn't flinch, her calm unshaken. Good. Let him see us. It'll rattle Hyman, rattled people slip up. Back in Millbrook later that morning, Linda stepped into her office and froze. The room looked like a tornado had torn through it. Papers littered the floor like fallen leaves. Her carefully constructed wall of evidence reduced to a tangle of string and torn photos. Officer Cole appeared in the doorway, his young face etched with worry, his uniform slightly askew as if he'd rushed over. "I tried to stop them," he said, his voice cracking with frustration. Mara had the chief's blessing. They didn't even try to hide it this time. Linda knelt amid the wreckage, gathering papers with hands that trembled not from fear, but from a simmering rage. "Did they take anything?" she asked, her tone sharp. Cole shook his head, shifting his weight nervously. "No. I think it was a messagey, a warning to back off." He paused, then added, "There's more. Bradford Building Corp just filed permits for a massive development. They're planning to bulldoze half of Main Street." Linda's head snapped up, her mind racing as she pulled up the property records on her laptop. The pieces clicked into place with chilling clarity. "The businesses they've been using to launder money, they own those buildings too," she said, her voice low and fierce. Cole nodded, his eyes wide. "Bought him through shell companies over the past year. Most folks didn't even know they were selling to the same outfit. This was bigger than money laundering now. They were using dirty cash to buy up Millbrook, likely to transform it into something far more lucrative. The small businesses weren't just fronts, they were stepping stones in a grander scheme." Linda was about to dive into the development plans when her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. An unknown number flashed on the screen, the message stark and menacing. "Back off, or things get ugly. Final warning." She snapped a photo of it and fired it off to Bennett. His reply came instantly. "We're assembling a task force. Hang tight." But Linda wasn't one to sit idle. She turned to Cole, her eyes burning with determination. "I need a favor. Can you get me the station's visitor logs for the last 6 months? Cole hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard, but he nodded. "Give me an hour." While she waited, an encrypted email pinged in her inbox from one of her financial analysts. They'd cracked the offshore transfer pattern. Money wasn't just bouncing through the Caymans. It was flowing to accounts tied to a notorious Boston crime family. The realization hit Linda like a freight train. This wasn't just about cleaning cash. It was about territory. Millbrook, with its prime location and corrupt cops, was the perfect foothold for their expansion. They weren't just laundering money through the town, they were buying it outright. When Cole returned with the logs, her suspicions solidified. Regular visitorsmen linked to the crime family had been meeting with Morris and the chief for months. She was documenting this damning evidence when shouts erupted from the main office. Morris's voice thundered down the hall, raw with fury. "Where is she? Martinez, get out here." Linda saved her files to an encrypted drive, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She stepped into the hallway, where Morris stood like a bull ready to charge. His face flushed a violent red. He clutched a crumpled paper in his fist, waving it like a weapon. "You filed for a federal warrant to dig into my accounts," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. "Actually," Linda replied, her tone cool and unshaken, "that warrant was approved an hour ago. The FBI's already combing through your records." Morris lunged forward, his fists clenched, but Cole darted between them, his stance protective despite the fear flickering in his eyes. "Steve, don't do something stupid," he warned, his voice trembling but firm. Morris glared at Linda, his breath heaving. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he snarled. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," she shot back, her gaze piercing. "A dirty cop who sold out his town to criminals. The only question is how many others are in on it." The chief emerged from his office, his face pale and drawn, a man caught between loyalty and dread. "Morris, my office, now," he barked, his voice strained. As they retreated, Linda caught the eyes of the other officers watching from the sidelines. Some glared with hostility, their allegiance to Morris clear, others looked shaken, their faith in the system crumbling, and a few, like Cole, seemed relieved that the festering rot was finally being exposed. Back in her office, Linda dialed Bennett, her voice urgent. "It's happening. Morris is cracking. We need to move fast before they torch the evidence." Bennett's response was swift. "Task force is ready. We roll at dawn. Can you keep it together till then?" She glanced at the threatening text still glowing on her phone. Then at the wreckage of her office. "They've tried intimidation and trashing my work. What's next?" Bennett's tone turned grave. "Be careful, Linda. Cornered corrupt cops are dangerous." That evening, as she prepared to leave, Linda uploaded every scrap of her investigation to a secure server. What had started as a routine money laundering probe had spiraled into something monstrous, a criminal empire sinking its claws into Millbrook, propped up by the very people sworn to protect it. As she drove home, her headlights caught the glint of two cars trailing her. One was Morris's personal vehicle, its familiar dented fender unmistakable. The other was an SUV she'd seen lurking behind Mario's Pizza. Instead of heading home, she turned toward the police station. If they wanted a showdown, she'd give it to them where cameras and witnesses could bear testament. The real victory wasn't just in the evidence she'd amass at it, was in dragging this corruption into the light. Tomorrow, when the FBI task force descended, there'd be no shadows left for Morris and his ilk to hide in. Linda parked in the station lot, the silence pressing against her ears as she watched in her rearview mirror. Morris and two men from the SUV approached, their silhouettes stark against the sodium glow of the streetlights. She hit record on her phone, placing it on the dashboard, and stepped out into the night. Whatever came next would seal the fate of her investigation into Millbrook itself. Justice demanded consequences, and Linda was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. In the dim light of the Millbrook police station parking lot, Linda Martinez stood firm, her heart pounding, but her voice steady as she faced Officer Morris and the two sharply dressed men who flanked him. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles into your bones when you know you're staring down something rotten. Morris, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face that had seen too many compromises, loomed just a few feet away, his uniform suddenly seeming less a badge of honor and more a shield for something darker. The two strangers, their expensive suits clashing with the small-town dust and cracked pavement, exuded a polished menace. One of them, Agent Martinez, no relation to Linda, spoke first, his voice sliding through the night like oil over water, smooth yet laced with a threat that made her skin prickle. "We've heard you've been stirring up trouble in our town," he said, his eyes narrowing as if sizing her up for a fight she couldn't win. Linda tilted her head, a flicker of defiance sparking in her chest. "Your town? Funny. I didn't realize the Rizzo crime family had planted their flag in Millbrook. Should I expect a parade to make it official?" The man's face tightened, his jaw clenching as if her words had struck a nerve he couldn't quite hide. Inside, Linda's mind raced. She had been warned, oh yes, multiple times, in hissed phone calls and cryptic notes slipped under her motel room door. "Stay out of it," they'd said, "or things get messy." But messy was where she thrived, where the truth always seemed to bubble up through the cracks. She caught a glimpse of Officer Cole through the station window, his boyish features taut with worry as he watched the standoff unfold. She gave him the slightest nod, a silent plea wrapped in trust, and he vanished from sight, his footsteps echoing faintly in her mind as she turned back to her adversaries. "Let's cut to the chase," she said, her tone sharp enough to slice through the humid night air. "I know about the money laundering, those neat little stacks of cash funneled through local businesses. I know about the property deals, how you're snapping up land with scrub funds. And I know you've got corrupt officers like Morris here guarding your dirty little empire. By tomorrow morning, everyone else will know too." The second man stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, his presence radiating a quiet fury that made Linda's pulse quicken. "Tomorrow's a long way off," he murmured, his voice low and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. But before she could respond, the night erupted into chaos. Palace cars roared into the lot, their sirens wailing like banshees, red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. Officer Cole burst from the station doors, his youthful energy now hardened into resolve. Flanked by a handful of officers with weapons drawn, their faces a mix of determination and dread. "Step away from Agent Martinez," Cole barked, his voice steady despite the tremor Linda knew he must feel. "Hands where we can see them." Morris whirled around, his face twisting into a mask of rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Cole?" he spat, his fists balling at his sides. Cole met his glare without flinching. The right thing, for once, he shot back, and in that moment, Linda saw the flicker of a man who'd finally found his spine. The two men in suits exchanged a quick, calculating glance, their hands twitching near their jackets where Linda knew weapons were concealed bulges. She'd spotted the moment they'd stepped out of their sleek SUV. She held her breath, every nerve screaming that one wrong move could turn this into a bloodbath. But they didn't draw. They were too smart, too aware of the odds shifting against them. Inside, Cole commanded, gesturing toward the station's main office, "All of you." The group shuffled in, the air heavy with unspoken alliances and betrayals. Inside, the room was a battlefield of loyalty. Some officers rallied behind Cole, their postures rigid with purpose, while others hovered near Morris, their eyes darting nervously. A few lingered in the shadows, caught in the purgatory of indecision, their faces pale with the weight of what was coming. Then the chief stormed out of his office, his barrel chest heaving, his voice booming like thunder. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping the room like a spotlight searching for guilt. "Sir," Cole said, stepping forward, his voice cutting through the chaos, "we've got evidence that Officer Morris and these men are neck-deep in criminal activity. Agent Martinez has proof." The chief's ruddy face drained of color, his thick brows knitting together as he processed the accusation. "Everyone, conference room." "Now," he growled, his tone leaving no room for argument. They filed in, the scrape of chairs against the linoleum floor mingling with the hum of tension. Linda plugged her laptop into the projector, her fingers trembling slightly in it from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally laying her cards on the table. "Let me show you what's really been happening in your town," she said, her voice steady as she clicked through slides that painted a damning picture. Money laundering through mom-and-pop shops, property purchases masked by clean cash, kickbacks to Morris and his cronies, and a web of ties to the Rizzo crime family. For 20 minutes, she unraveled their scheme, her words weaving a noose that tightened with every revelation. "Tomorrow morning," she concluded, "an FBI task force will sweep in and arrest everyone involved. But right now, you've got a choice to make." The chief, who'd been shifting in his seat, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table, finally spoke, his voice tight with unease. "These are serious accusations, Agent Martinez." Linda leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "They're not accusations, they're facts. And I haven't even shown you the worst of it." She clicked to a new file, and the room gasped as surveillance photos flickered onto the screen. The chief himself, caught in grainy clarity, shaking hands with known crime family members under the sodium glow of a street lamp. Chaos exploded. Her eyes lunged across the table, his hands clawing for her throat. But Cole and another officer tackled him, pinning him to the ground as he roared obscenities. The two suited men bolted for the door, only to find their escape blocked by officers who'd chosen their side. Linda's phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from Bennett. "Task force moving in early. Hold position." She glanced at the chief, who'd slumped in his chair, his broad shoulders sagging as the fight drained out of him. Some officers slipped out, no doubt racing to shred evidence of their own sins, while others fumbled for their phones, dialing lawyers with shaking hands. But before anyone could flee, sirens screamed outside, and FBI vehicles screeched into the lot, disgorging agents in tactical gear who stormed the station like a tidal wave. Bennett strode into the conference room, his lean frame cutting through the haze of shock. "Good work, Martinez," he said, then turned to the room. "Gentlemen, get comfortable. It's going to be a long night." The station transformed into a hive of activity officers separated, interrogated, some spilling confessions in hopes of leniency, others clamming up behind legal walls. The two men from the SUV, revealed as high-ranking Rizzo lieutenants, sat stone-faced as their empire crumbled. Linda's evidence, paired with their presence, unleashed a flurry of raids across Millbrook, each one peeling back another layer of the crime family's audacious plan. Use the town as a proving ground, then replicate the scheme in small towns nationwide, buying up land with laundered money, bending local cops to their will, and choking communities until they owned them outright. By dawn, the scope of it all crystallized. A chilling testament to how close they'd come to succeeding. Linda stood at her office window, exhaustion tugging at her limbs as she watched Morris, the chief, and a handful of others shuffled out in handcuffs. Their heads bowed under the weight of their own choices. Cole approached, his freckled face etched with fatigue, but lit with a quiet pride. "How'd you know which of us would step up?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder. Linda offered a tired smile. "I didn't. I just had faith there were still good people here, people who'd do what's right when it counted." Bennett joined them, a steaming coffee cup in hand, his sharp eyes glinting with approval. "Martinez, Boston wants you heading the expanded investigation. This might be happening in other towns already." Linda frowned, her mind drifting to Millbrook's wounded businesses and seized properties. "What about this place?" she asked. Bennett clapped her shoulder. "We'll sort it out. The town hall might even come out stronger without that corruption gnawing at its roots." Outside, the first reporters gathered, their cameras flashing like vultures circling a kill. The story would break soon, a small-town laundering bust ballooning into a sprawling criminal takedown. All because one agent refused to blink in the face of threats. But to Linda, that wasn't the heart of it. Justice had prevailed. A fragile community spared from predators cloaked in power, and that was a lesson worth etching into. The world, abuse power, and the consequences will find you. Relentless and unyielding, Cole cleared his throat, pulling her from her thoughts. "Some of us are planning to gut the department, rebuild it right. Could use your input." Linda nodded, gathering her files with a renewed spark. "I'm in. But first, we've got work to finish. This isn't over." 6 months later, Linda stood in a packed Boston courtroom, the air thick with anticipation, as she stepped down from the witness stand. Her testimony had just dismantled the Rizzo scheme for the jury. Every detail of Millbrook's near collapse laid bare. Across the room, Morris glared from his orange jumpsuit, his once cocky swagger replaced by a simmering, impotent rage. The prosecution's case was ironclad: financial trails, surveillance stills, witness accounts all stitched together by Linda's relentless pursuit. 17 defendants, from Morris to the chief to Rizzo heavyweights, faced the gavel, their fates sealed by their own greed. Outside, reporters swarmed her, a microphone thrust into her face. "Agent Martinez, how do you crack this conspiracy?" one asked. She paused, choosing her words with care. "It wasn't just me. It was the officers in Millbrook who chose integrity over corruption. They're the ones who made this possible." Bennett caught up to her as the crowd thinned, a grin tugging at his lips, modest as ever. "Martinez, jury's out tomorrow. Know how this ends." Linda's mind was already elsewhere. "What about the other towns?" she pressed. 3 more cases busted wide open because of you." He replied, "Same playbook: laundering, land grabs, crooked cops. But Millbrook taught us the signs who got ahead of it. They ducked into their usual coffee shop, a cozy refuge from the trial's storm." And Linda froze at the sight of Colino Deputy Chief Cole waiting at a table, his uniform crisp, his smile warm. "Thought you'd want the update in person," he said as they settled in. "Millbrook's thriving. Seized businesses sold to locals, main streets buzzing again." Linda's heart lifted, a rare lightness settling in. "And the department?" she asked. Cole beamed. "Total overhaul: new training, oversight, community programs. We're earning back trust, one day at a time." He paused, then added, "The FBI Academy wants you to speak, share what you've learned." Linda glanced out the window, the morning sun casting long shadows over a world still riddled with shadows of its own. She'd be ready because justice wasn't just a moment, it was a promise, one she'd keep fighting for, town by town, until the corrupt learned they could never outrun its reach. Linda Martinez sat at the worn wooden table of the quiet diner, her fingers tracing slow, deliberate circles around the rim of her coffee mug. The steam rose in faint wisps, curling upward like the thoughts swirling in her mind. She gazed into the dark liquid, her brow furrowing as she replayed the whirlwind of the past few months. "You know what still gets me?" she said, her voice soft but tinged with a quiet awe. "How close they came to pulling it off. If we hadn't caught those odd little spikes in the laundromat deposits, those repetitive, sneaky patterns, you don't know if we'd have ever cracked it." Across from her, Bennett, her longtime mentor, leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes glinting with a mix of pride and amusement. "That's what sets you apart, Martinez," he replied, his tone steady and warm. "You've got an eye for the details others breeze right past. It's why your case is turning into a gold standard practically. A masterclass for rooting out corruption in places people don't even think to look." As the words settled between them, Bennett reached into his jacket pocket with a faint rustle, pulling out a crisp, unassuming envelope. He slid it across the table with a casual flick of his wrist, but there was a weight to the gesture that made Linda's pulse quicken. She hesitated for a split second, her fingers brushing the paper before she opened it. Inside lay a letter that felt like both a reward and a challenge. An offer to become unit chief of a brand new task force small-town criminal enterprise unit, headquartered in Boston. Her eyes darted across the page, absorbing the details. 30 towns, scattered across the map, had already been flagged, each showing eerie echoes of the same suspicious patterns. She'd unraveled in Millbrook. The Bureau wasn't just asking her to take the job. They were handing her the reins to build her own team, set her own course, and chase justice wherever it led. Linda's mind ignited with possibilities, her thoughts racing like wildfire. "I've been tossing around an idea," she said, her voice gaining strength as she looked up at Bennett. "What if we used AI to spot these patterns, something cutting edge, designed to sniff out shady business dealings in small communities before they can take root?" "It's already greenlit." Bennett nodded, a slow, approving grin spreading across his face. "Your team's getting the best tech we've got. Full access, no corners cut." Beside her, Cole, her sharp-witted partner, who'd been with her through the sleepless nights and endless dead ends, raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Here's to the crooks who think they're untouchable," he said, his voice dripping with dry humor. "They're about to get a rude wake-up call." The three of them lingered there, the hum of the diner fading into the background as they mapped out the future. Linda felt a spark of something fierce and unshakable growing inside here, a blend of determination and hope. Then her phone buzzed sharply against the table, jolting her from her thoughts. She glanced down, and a news alert lit up the screen. Millbrook case sparks massive FBI crackdown on small town. Organized crime. Her breath caught as she skimmed the headline, then the article. There, in bold quotes, was the FBI director himself, singing her praises and those of her team for dismantling a criminal network so cunning it had nearly choked the life out of rural America. Linda's chest tightened with a mix of disbelief and quiet pride. She wasn't used to the spotlight, but it felt good to know the work mattered. Later that evening, she pulled into the driveway of her sister Maria's cozy suburban home, the familiar scent of garlic and melted cheese wafting through the air as she stepped inside. Maria, her older sister by 3 years and her fiercest cheerleader, had tracked every twist of the Millbrook case like a hawk, clipping articles from the local paper and stacking them in a neat pile on her kitchen counter. Well, Maria teased as she set out steaming plates of lasagna, her dark eyes twinkling with mischief. "Looks like my little sister's turning into a celebrity," Linda laughed, brushing off the comment with a wave of her hand. "Hardly. I'm just doing what I signed up for." But Maria wouldn't let it go, her voice softening with admiration. "No, you're incredible at it. Think back to when you first landed in Millbrook. Day one, you knew something was off. You felt it in your gut. Even when everyone else told you to drop it." Linda paused, a forkful of lasagna halfway to her mouth, as memories flooded back. Those early weeks had been brutal, cold stares from locals, the veiled threats from men in pressed suits, the late nights hunched over spreadsheets in a dimly lit motel room. "I couldn't let it go," she admitted, her voice low. "Not when I saw how it was tearing people apart, their businesses, their trust. I had to fight." Maria reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "And now you're going to save other towns." Mom and Dad would have been over the moon. The next morning dawned crisp and gray, the air heavy with anticipation as Linda stood in the courthouse, her heart pounding against her ribs. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, and then the word came, guilty, on every single count. Morris, the slick ringleader with his tailored jackets and crocodile tears, slumped in his seat as the gavel fell. His cronies, a ragtag crew of enforcers and money men, exchanged grim looks. Decades behind bars stretched out before them like an endless road. The crime family's grand plan to sink their claws into small-town America had crumbled to dust. Linda lingered in the hallway afterward, her shoes clicking against the polished floor. When a voice called out, "Agent Martinez," she turned to see Tony, the weary owner of Mari's Pizza, jogging toward her. His apron was gone now, replaced by a faded jacket, but his eyes shone with something new relief, maybe even hope. He'd been one of the reluctant cogs in the laundering scheme, strong-armed into compliance, but he'd turned witness when it mattered most. "I just wanted to say thanks," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We're reopening next month. Clean this time. No more dirty money. You should swing by. First slice is on me." Linda smiled, genuinely this time. "I'd like that." "How's the town holding up?" Tony shrugged, then grinned. "Different. Better, though. People are talking again, real talk. About fixing things up, not just hiding from shadows. We've got meetings planned, legit ones, about building something good." As Linda drove back through Millbrook one last time, the town unfolded before her like a painting in progress. New storefronts gleamed where boarded-up windows once stood, and kids darted across the street, their laughter cutting through the quiet. It wasn't just the fresh paint or the bustling sidewalks, it was the shift in the air, the way people carried themselves now. This place was a testament to what happened when someone refused to bow to corruption, when one voice demanded justice and others rose to join it. Back in Boston, her new office waited, a stark contrast to the cramped desks of her past. Maps lined the walls, red pins dotting towns where shadows still lingered, waiting to be exposed. Her team handpicked agents with sharp minds and fiercer hearts would arrive next week, ready to dive in. A note from Bennett sat on her desk, scrawled in his familiar handwriting. Millbrook was the spark. "Show them what's next." Linda settled into her chair, the leather creaking softly, and opened her laptop. Files on the first target towns glowed on the screen, each one a puzzle, each one a fight. Somewhere out there, another group of predators thought they could prey on the overlooked and the vulnerable. They were wrong. Linda's resolve hardened as she began plotting her team's opening moves. This wasn't just about a promotion or a win, it was about proving that integrity could topple empires, that one person's refusal to bend could ripple outward, igniting change. The criminals had underestimated small towns, seeing them as soft targets ripe for the taking. Now, they'd face a reckoning led by a woman who'd memorized their playbook and rewritten the rules. As she worked late into the night, the glow of her screen casting shadows across the room, Linda felt a quiet thrill. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire stoked by those willing to stand in the heat. And she was just warming up.